I, Alexandre Manette, unfortunate physician, native of Beauvais, and afterwards resident in Paris, write this melancholy paper in my doleful cell in the Bastille. During the last month of the year, I write it at stolen intervals under every difficulty. I design to secrete it in the wall of the chimney, where I have slowly and laboriously made a place of concealment for it. Some pitying hand may find it there when I and my sorrows are dust. These words are formed by the rusty iron point with which I write with difficulty in scrapings of soot and charcoal from the chimney, mixed with blood, in the last month of the 10th year of my captivity. Hope has quite departed from my breast. I know from terrible warnings I have noted in myself that my reason will not long remain unimpaired. But I solemnly declare that I am at this time in the possession of my right mind, that my memory is exact and circumstantial, and that I write the truth as I shall answer for these my last recorded words, whether they be ever read by men or not, at the eternal judgment seat. One cloudy moonlight night in the 3rd week of December, I think the 22nd of the month in the year, I was walking on a retired part of the quay by the Seine for the refreshment of the frosty air, at an hour's distance from my place of residence in the street of the School of Medicine, when a carriage came along behind me, driven very fast. As I stood aside to let that carriage pass, apprehensive that it might otherwise run me down, a head was put out at the window, and a voice called to the driver to stop. The carriage stopped as soon as the driver could rein in his horses, and the same voice called to me by my name. I answered. The carriage was then so far in advance of me that 2 gentlemen had time to open the door and alight before I came up with it. I observed that they were both wrapped in cloaks and appeared to conceal themselves. As they stood side by side near the carriage door, I also observed that they both looked of about my own age, or rather younger, and that they were greatly alike in stature, manner, voice, and, as far as I could see, face too. "You are Dr. Manette?" said one. "I am." "Dr. Manette, formerly of Beauvais," said the other, "the young physician, originally an expert surgeon, who within the last year or 2 has made a rising reputation in Paris?" "Gentlemen," I returned, "I am that Dr. Manette of whom you speak so graciously." "We have been to your residence," said the first, "and not being so fortunate as to find you there, and being informed that you were probably walking in this direction, we followed in the hope of overtaking you. Will you please to enter the carriage?" The manner of both was imperious, and they both moved as these words were spoken so as to place me between themselves and the carriage door. They were armed. I was not. "Gentlemen," said I, "pardon me, but I usually inquire who does me the honour to seek my assistance, and what is the nature of the case to which I am summoned." The reply to this was made by him who had spoken second. "Doctor, your clients are people of condition. As to the nature of the case, our confidence in your skill assures us that you will ascertain it for yourself better than we can describe it. Enough. Will you please to enter the carriage?" I could do nothing but comply, and I entered it in silence. They both entered after me, the last springing in after putting up the steps. The carriage turned about and drove on at its former speed. I repeat this conversation exactly as it occurred. I have no doubt that it is, word for word, the same. I describe everything exactly as it took place, constraining my mind not to wander from the task. Where I make the broken marks that follow here, I leave off for the time, and put my paper in its hiding place. The carriage left the streets behind, passed the North Barrier, and emerged upon the country road. At 2/3 of a league from the barrier, I did not estimate the distance at that time, But afterwards, when I traversed it, it struck out of the main avenue, and presently stopped at a solitary house. We all three alighted and walked by a damp, soft footpath in a garden where a neglected fountain had overflowed to the door of the house. It was not opened immediately in answer to the ringing of the bell, and one of my two conductors struck the man who opened it with his heavy riding glove across the face. There was nothing in this action to attract my particular attention, for I had seen common people struck more commonly than dogs, but the other of the two, being angry likewise, struck the man in like manner with his arm. The look and bearing of the brothers were then so exactly alike that I then first perceived them to be twin brothers. From the time of our alighting at the outer gate, which we found locked, and which one of the brothers had opened to admit us and had relocked, I had heard cries proceeding from an upper chamber. I was conducted to this chamber straight, the cries growing louder as we ascended the stairs, and I found a patient in a high fever of the brain, lying on a bed. The patient was a woman of great beauty, and young, assuredly not much past 20. Her hair was torn and ragged, and her arms were bound to her sides with sashes and handkerchiefs. I noticed that these bonds were all portions of a gentleman's dress. On one of them, which was a fringed scarf for a dress of ceremony, I saw the armorial bearings of a noble and the letter E. I saw this within the first minute of my contemplation of the patient, for, in her restless strivings, she had turned over on her face on the edge of the bed, had drawn the end of the scarf into her mouth, and was in danger of suffocation. My first act was to put out my hand to relieve her breathing, and, in moving the scarf aside, the embroidery in the corner caught my sight. I turned her gently over, placed my hands upon her breast to calm her and keep her down, and looked into her face. Her eyes were dilated and wild, and she constantly uttered piercing shrieks and repeated the words, "My husband, my father, and my brother," and then counted up to 12 and said, "Hush." For an instant and no more she would pause to listen, and then the piercing shrieks would begin again, and she would repeat the cry, "My husband, my father, and my brother," and would count up to 12 and say, "Hush." There was no variation in the order or the manner. There was no cessation, but the regular moment's pause in the utterance of these sounds. "How long," I asked, "has this lasted?" To distinguish the brothers, I will call them the elder and the younger. By the elder I mean him who exercised the most authority. It was the elder who replied, "Since about this hour last night. She has a husband, a father, and a brother." "A brother?" "I do not address her brother," he answered with great contempt. "No. She has some recent association with the number 12. The younger brother impatiently rejoined, "With 12 o'clock?" "See, gentlemen," said I, still keeping my hands upon her breast, "how useless I am, as you have brought me. If I had known what I was coming to see, I could have come provided. As it is, time must be lost. There are no medicines to be obtained in this lonely place." The elder brother looked to the younger, who said haughtily, "There is a case of medicines here," and brought it from a closet and put it on the table. "Shh! Shh!" I opened some of the bottles, smelt them, and put the stoppers to my lips. If I had wanted to use anything save narcotic medicines that were poisons in themselves, I would not have administered any of those. "Do you doubt them?" asked the younger brother. "You see, monsieur, I am going to use them," I replied, and said no more. I made the patient swallow, with great difficulty, and after many efforts, the dose that I desired to give. As I intended to repeat it after a while, and as it was necessary to watch its influence, I then sat down by the side of the bed. There was a timid and suppressed woman in attendance, wife of the man downstairs, who had retreated into a corner. The house was damp and decayed, indifferently furnished, evidently recently occupied and temporarily used. Some thick old hangings had been nailed up before the windows to deaden the sound of the shrieks. They continued to be uttered in their regular succession, with the cry, "My husband, my father, and my brother," the counting up to 12, and "Hush!" The frenzy was so violent that I had not unfastened the bandages restraining the arms, but I had looked to them to see that they were not painful. The only spark of encouragement in the case was that my hand upon the sufferer's breast had this much soothing influence, that for minutes at a time it tranquilized the figure. It had no effect upon the cries. No pendulum could be more regular. For the reason that my hand had this effect, I assume, I had sat by the side of the bed for half an hour, with the two brothers looking on, before the elder said, "There is another patient." I was startled and asked, "Is it a pressing case?" "You had better see," he carelessly answered, and took up a light. The other patient lay in a back room across a second staircase, which was a species of loft over a stable. There was a low plastered ceiling to a part of it. The rest was open to the ridge of the tiled roof, and there were beams across. Hay and straw were stored in that portion of the place, faggots for firing, and a heap of apples in sand. I had to pass through that part to get at the other. My memory is circumstantial and unshaken. I try it with these details, and I see them all in this, my cell in the Bastille, near the close of the 10th year of my captivity, as I saw them all that night. On some hay on the ground, with a cushion thrown under his head, lay a handsome peasant boy, a boy of not more than 17 at the most. He lay on his back with his teeth set, his right hand clenched on his breast, and his glaring eyes looking straight upward. I could not see where his wound was as I kneeled on one knee over him, but I could see that he was dying of a wound from a sharp point. "I am a doctor, my poor fellow," said I. "Let me examine it." "I do not want it examined," he answered. "Let it be." It was under his hand, and I soothed him to let me move his hand away. The wound was a sword thrust, received from 20 to 24 hours before, but no skill could have saved him if it had been looked to without delay. He was then dying fast. As I turned my eyes to the elder brother, I saw him looking down at this handsome boy whose life was ebbing out, as if he were a wounded bird or hare or rabbit, not at all as if he were a fellow creature. "How has this been done, monsieur?" said I. "A crazed young common dog, a serf, forced my brother to draw upon him, and has fallen by my brother's sword like a gentleman." There was no touch of pity, sorrow, or kindred humanity in this answer. The speaker seemed to acknowledge that it was inconvenient to have that different order of creature dying there, and that it would have been better if he had died in the usual obscure routine of his vermin kind. He was quite incapable of any compassionate feeling about the boy, or about his fate. The boy's eyes had slowly moved to him as he had spoken, and they now slowly moved to me. "Doctor, they are very proud, these nobles, but we common dogs are proud too sometimes. They plunder us, outrage us, beat us, kill us, but we have a little pride left sometimes. Have you seen her, doctor? The shrieks and the cries were audible there, though subdued by the distance. He referred to them as if she were lying in our presence. I said, "I have seen her. She is my sister, doctor. They have had their shameful rights, these nobles, in the modesty and virtue of our sisters many years, but we have had good girls among us. I know it, and have heard my father say so. She was a good girl. She was betrothed to a good young man too, a tenant of his. We were all tenants of his, that man's who stands there. The other is his brother, the worst of a bad race." It was with the greatest difficulty that the boy gathered bodily force to speak, but his spirit spoke with a dreadful emphasis. "We were so robbed by that man who stands there, as all we common dogs are, by those superior, beings taxed by him without mercy, obliged to work for him without pay, obliged to grind our corn at his mill, obliged to feed scores of his tame birds on our wretched crops, and forbidden for our lives to keep a single tame bird of our own, pillaged and plundered to that degree that when we chanced to have a bit of meat, we ate it in fear, with the door barred and the shutters closed, that his people should not see it and take it from us. I say, we were so robbed and hunted and were made so poor, that our father told us it was a dreadful thing to bring a child into the world, and that what we should most pray for was that our women might be barren and our miserable race die out. I had never before seen the sense of being oppressed bursting forth like a fire. I had supposed that it must be latent in the people somewhere, but I had never seen it break out until I saw it in the dying boy. Nevertheless, doctor, my sister married. He was ailing at that time, poor fellow, and she married her lover, that she might tend and comfort him in our cottage, our dog hut, as that man would call it. She had not been married many weeks when that man's brother saw her and admired her, and asked that man to lend her to him for what a husband's among us. He was willing enough, but my sister was good and virtuous, and hated his brother with a hatred as strong as mine. What did the two then, to persuade her husband to use his influence with her to make her willing? The boy's eyes, which had been fixed on mine, slowly turned to the looker-on, and I saw in the two faces that all he said was true. The two opposing kinds of pride confronting one another. I can see, even in this Bastille, the gentleman's all negligent indifference, the peasant's all trodden-down sentiment and passionate revenge. You know, doctor, that it is among the rights of these nobles to harness us common dogs to carts and drive us. They so harnessed him and drove him. You know that it is among their rights to keep us in their grounds all night, quieting the frogs, in order that their noble sleep may not be disturbed. They kept him out in the unwholesome mists at night, and ordered him back into harness in the day. But he was not persuaded. No! Taken out of harness one day at noon, to feed if he could find food, he sobbed 12 times, once for every stroke of the bell, and died on her bosom. Nothing human could have held life in the boy, but his determination to tell all his wrong. He forced back the gathering shadows of death, as he forced his clenched right hand to remain clenched and to cover his wound. Then, with that man's permission, and even with his aid, his brother took her away. In spite of what I know she must have told his brother, and what that is, will not be long unknown to you, doctor. If it is now, his brother took her away for his pleasure and diversion for a little while. I saw her pass me on the road. When I took the tidings home, our father's heart burst. He never spoke one of the words that filled it. I took my young sister, for I have another, to a place beyond the reach of this man, and where, at least, she will never be his vassal. Then I tracked the brother here, and last night climbed in a common dog, but sword in hand. Where is the loft window? It was somewhere here. The room was darkening to his sight. The world was narrowing around him. I glanced about me, and saw that the hay and straw were trampled over the floor as if there had been a struggle. She heard me, and ran in. I told her not to come near us till he was dead. He came in, and first tossed me some pieces of money, then struck at me with a whip. But I, though a common dog, so struck at him as to make him draw. Let him break into as many pieces as he will, the sword that he stained with my common blood. He drew to defend himself, thrust at me with all his skill for his life. My glance had fallen, but a few moments before, on the fragments of a broken sword, lying among the hay. That weapon was a gentleman's. In another place lay an old sword that seemed to have been a soldier's. "Now, lift me up, doctor, lift me up. Where is he?" "He is not here," I said, supporting the boy, and thinking that he referred to the brother. "He! Proud as these nobles are, he is afraid to see me. Where is the man who was here? Turn my face to him." I did so, raising the boy's head against my knee, but, invested for the moment with extraordinary power, he raised himself completely, obliging me to rise too, or I could not have still supported him. "Marquis," said the boy, turned to him with his eyes opened wide, and his right hand raised, "in the days when all these things are to be answered for, I summon you and yours to the last of your bad race, to answer for them. I mark this cross of blood upon you as a sign that I do it. In the days when all these things are to be answered for, I summon your brother, the worst of the bad race, to answer for them separately. I mark this cross of blood upon him as a sign that I do it." Twice he put his hand to the wound in his breast, and with his forefinger drew a cross in the air. He stood for an instant with the finger yet raised, and as it dropped, he dropped with it, and I laid him down dead. Coup. When I returned to the bedside of the young woman, I found her raving in precisely the same order of continuity. I knew that this might last for many hours, and that it would probably end in the silence of the grave. I repeated the medicines I had given her, and I sat at the side of the bed until the night was far advanced. She never abated the piercing quality of her shrieks, never stumbled in the distinctness or the order of her words. They were always my husband, my father, and my brother. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Hush! This lasted 26 hours from the time when I first saw her. I had come and gone twice, and was again sitting by her when she began to falter. I did what little could be done to assist that opportunity, and by she sank into a lethargy, and lay like the dead. It was as if the wind and rain had lulled at last after a long and fearful storm. I released her arms, and called the woman to assist me to compose her figure and the dress she had torn. It was then that I knew her condition to be that of one in whom the first expectations of being a mother have arisen, and it was then that I lost the little hope I had had of her. "Is she dead?" asked the Marquis, whom I will still describe as the elder brother, coming booted into the room from his horse. "Not dead," said I, "but like to die." "What strength there is in these common bodies," he said, looking down at her with some curiosity. "There is prodigious strength," I answered him, "in sorrow and despair." He first laughed at my words, and then frowned at them. He moved a chair with his foot near to mine, ordered the woman away, and said in a subdued voice, "Doctor, finding my brother in this difficulty with these hinds, I recommended that your aid should be invited. Your reputation is high, and, as a young man with your fortune to make, you are probably mindful of your interest. The things that you see here are things to be seen, and not spoken of." I listened to the patient's breathing and avoided answering. "Do you honor me with your attention, doctor?" "Monsieur," said I, "in my profession, the communications of patients are always received in confidence." I was guarded in my answer, for I was troubled in my mind with what I had heard and seen. Her breathing was so difficult to trace that I carefully tried the pulse and the heart. There was life, and no more. Looking round as I resumed my seat, I found both the brothers intent upon me. The cold is so severe. I am so fearful of being detected and consigned to an underground cell and total darkness that I must abridge this narrative. There is no confusion of failure in my memory. It can recall and could detail every word that was ever spoken between me and those brothers. She lingered for a week. Towards the last, I could understand some few syllables that she said to me by placing my ear close to her lips. She asked me where she was, and I told her. Who I was, and I told her. It was in vain that I asked her for her family name. She faintly shook her head upon the pillow and kept her secret, as the boy had done. I had no opportunity of asking her any question until I had told the brothers she was sinking fast and could not live another day. Until then, though no one was ever presented to her consciousness, save the woman and myself, one or other of them had always jealously sat behind the curtain at the head of the bed when I was there. But when it came to that, they seemed careless what communication I might hold with her, as if the thought passed through my mind. I were dying too. I always observed that their pride bitterly resented the younger brothers, as I call him, having crossed swords with a peasant, and that peasant a boy. The only consideration that appeared to affect the mind of either of them was the consideration that this was highly degrading to the family and was ridiculous. As often as I caught the younger brother's eyes, their expression reminded me that he disliked me deeply for knowing what I knew from the boy. He was smoother and more polite to me than the elder. But I saw this. I also saw that I was an encumbrance in the mind of the elder too. My patient died 2 hours before midnight at a time by my watch, answering almost to the minute when I had first seen her. I was alone with her, when her forlorn young head drooped gently on one side, and all her earthly wrongs and sorrows ended. The brothers were waiting in a room downstairs, impatient to ride away. I had heard them, alone at the bedside, striking their boots with their riding whips and loitering up and down. "At last she's dead?" said the elder when I went in. "She is dead," said I. "I congratulate you, my brother," were his words as he turned round. He had before offered me money, which I had postponed taking. He now gave me a rouleau of gold. I took it from his hand, but laid it on the table. I had considered the question, and had resolved to accept nothing. "Pray excuse me," said I. "Under the circumstances, no." They exchanged looks, but bent their heads to me as I bent mine to them, and we parted without another word on either side. Psst. Shh. Shh. I am weary, 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 worn down by misery. I cannot read what I have written with this gaunt hand. Early in the morning, the rouleau of gold was left at my door in a little box, with my name on the outside. From the first, I had anxiously considered what I ought to do. I decided, that day, to write privately to the minister, stating the nature of the 2 cases to which I had been summoned, and the place to which I had gone, in effect stating all the circumstances. I knew what court influence was, and what the immunities of the nobles were, and I expected that the matter would never be heard of, but I wished to relieve my own mind. I had kept the matter a profound secret, even from my wife, and this, too, I resolved to state in my letter. I had no apprehension whatever of my real danger, but I was conscious that there might be danger for others if others were compromised by possessing the knowledge that I possessed. I was much engaged that day, and could not complete my letter that night. I rose long before my usual time next morning to finish it. It was the last day of the year. The letter was lying before me, just completed, when I was told that a lady waited who wished to see me. I am growing more and more unequal to the task I have set myself. It is so cold, so dark, my senses are so benumbed, and the gloom upon me is so dreadful. The lady was young, engaging, and handsome, but not marked for long life. She was in great agitation. She presented herself to me as the wife of the Marquis Saint-Evremond. I connected the title by which the boy had addressed the elder brother with the initial letter embroidered on the scarf, and had no difficulty in arriving at the conclusion that I had seen that nobleman very lately. My memory is still accurate, but I cannot write the words of our conversation. I suspect that I am watched more closely than I was, and I know not at what times I may be watched. She had in part suspected, and in part discovered, the main facts of the cruel story, of her husband's share in it, and my being resorted to. She did not know that the girl was dead. Her hope had been, she said in great distress, to show her, in secret, a woman's sympathy. Her hope had been to avert the wrath of heaven from a house that had long been hateful to the suffering many. She had reasons for believing that there was a young sister living, and her greatest desire was to help that sister. I could tell her nothing but that there was such a sister. Beyond that I knew nothing. Her inducement to come to me, relying on my confidence, had been the hope that I could tell her the name and place of abode. Whereas, to this wretched hour, I am ignorant of both. Tisky, these scraps of paper fail me. One was taken from me with a warning, yesterday. I must finish my record today. She was a good, compassionate lady, and not happy in her marriage. How could she be? The brother distrusted and disliked her, and his influence was all opposed to her. She stood in dread of him, and in dread of her husband too. When I handed her down to the door, there was a child, a pretty boy from 2 to 3 years old, in her carriage. "For his sake, doctor," she said, pointing to him in tears, "I would do all I can to make what poor amends I can. He will never prosper in his inheritance otherwise. I have a presentiment that if no other innocent atonement is made for this, it will one day be required of him. What I have left to call my own, it is little beyond the worth of a few jewels. I will make it the first charge of his life to bestow, with the compassion and lamenting of his dead mother, on this injured family, if the sister can be discovered." She kissed the boy and said, caressing him, "It is for thine own dear sake. Thou wilt be faithful, little Charles?" The child answered her bravely, "Yes." I kissed her hand, and she took him in her arms, and went away caressing him. I never saw her more. As she had mentioned her husband's name in the faith that I knew it, I added no mention of it to my letter. I sealed my letter and, not trusting it out of my own hands, delivered it myself that day. That night, the last night of the year, towards 9 o'clock, a man in a black dress rang at my gate, demanded to see me, and softly followed my servant, Ernest Defarge, a youth, upstairs. When my servant came into the room where I sat with my wife, oh, my wife, beloved of my heart, my fair young English wife, we saw the man, who was supposed to be at the gate, standing silent behind him. "An urgent case in the Rue Saint-Honoré," he said. "It would not detain me. He had a coach in waiting. It brought me here. It brought me to my grave. When I was clear of the house, a black muffler was drawn tightly over my mouth from behind, and my arms were pinioned. The two brothers crossed the road from a dark corner, and identified me with a single gesture. The Marquis took from his pocket the letter I had written, showed it me, burnt it in the light of a lantern that was held, and extinguished the ashes with his foot. Not a word was spoken. I was brought here. I was brought to my living grave. If it had pleased God to put it in the hard heart of either of the brothers, in all these frightful years, to grant me any tidings of my dearest wife, so much as to let me know by a word, whether alive or dead, I might have thought that he had not quite abandoned them. But now I believe that the mark of the Red Cross is fatal to them, and that they have no part in his mercies. And them and their descendants, to the last of their race, I, Alexandra Manette, unhappy prisoner, do this last night of the year, in my unbearable agony, denounce to the times when all these things shall be answered for. I denounce them to heaven and to earth. The Cauldron of Oil. About 1 French league distant from the city of Toulouse, there is a village called Croix Dorade. In the military history of England, this place is associated with a famous charge of the 18th Hussars, which united 2 separated columns of the British Army on the day before the Duke of Wellington fought the Battle of Toulouse. In the criminal history of France, the village is memorable as the scene of a daring crime, which was discovered and punished under circumstances sufficiently remarkable to merit preservation in the form of a plain narrative. I, the persons of the drama. In the year 1700, the resident priest of the village of Croix Dorade was Monsieur Pierre Célestin Chaubard. He was a man of no extraordinary energy or capacity, simple in his habits and sociable in his disposition. His character was irreproachable. He was strictly conscientious in the performance of his duties, and he was universally respected and beloved by all his parishioners. Among the members of his flock there was a family named Siadou. The head of the household, Saturnin Siadou, had been long established in business at Croix Dorade as an oil manufacturer. At the period of the events now to be narrated, he had attained the age of 60, and was a widower. His family consisted of 5 children, 3 young men, who helped him in the business, and 2 daughters. His nearest living relative was his sister, the widow Mireille. The widow resided principally at Toulouse. Her time in that city was mainly occupied in winding up the business affairs of her deceased husband, which had remained unsettled for a considerable period after his death, through delays in realizing certain sums of money owing to his representative. The widow had been left very well provided, for she was still a comely, attractive woman, and more than one substantial citizen of Toulouse had shown himself anxious to persuade her into marrying for the second time. But the widow Mireille lived on terms of great intimacy and affection with her brother Siadou and his family. She was sincerely attached to them, and sincerely unwilling, at her age, to deprive her nephews and nieces by a second marriage of the inheritance, or even of a portion of the inheritance, which would otherwise fall to them on her death. Animated by these motives, she closed her doors resolutely on all suitors who attempted to pay their court to her, with the one exception of a master butcher of Toulouse, whose name was Cantegrel. This man was a neighbor of the widow's, and had made himself useful by assisting her in the business complications which still hung about the realization of her late husband's estate. The preference which she showed for the master butcher was thus far of the purely negative kind. She gave him no absolute encouragement. She would not for a moment admit that there was the slightest prospect of her ever marrying him, but at the same time she continued to receive his visits, and she showed no disposition to restrict the neighborly intercourse between them for the future, within purely formal bounds. Under these circumstances, Saturnin Siadou began to be alarmed, and to think it time to bestir himself. He had no personal acquaintance with Cantegrel, who never visited the village, and Monsieur Chaubard, to whom he might otherwise have applied for advice, was not in a position to give an opinion. The priest and the master butcher did not even know each other by sight. In this difficulty, Saidu bethought himself of inquiring privately at Toulouse, in the hope of discovering some scandalous passages in Cantegrel's early life, which might fatally degrade him in the estimation of the widow Mireille Lehay. The investigation, as usual in such cases, produced rumours and reports in plenty, the greater part of which dated back to a period of the butcher's life when he had resided in the ancient town of Narbonne. One of these rumours, especially, was of so serious a nature that Saidu determined to test the truth or falsehood of it personally by travelling to Narbonne. He kept his intention a secret not only from his sister and his daughters, but also from his sons. They were young men, not over-patient in their tempers, and he doubted their discretion. Thus, nobody knew his real purpose but himself when he left home. His safe arrival at Narbonne was notified in a letter to his family. The letter entered into no particulars relating to his secret errand. It merely informed his children of the day when they might expect him back, and of certain social arrangements which he wished to be made to welcome him on his return. He proposed, on his way home, to stay 2 days at Castelnaudry for the purpose of paying a visit to an old friend who was settled there. According to this plan, his return to Croix-du-Rade would be deferred until Tuesday, the 26th of April, when his family might expect to see him about sunset in good time for supper. He further desired that a little party of friends might be invited to the meal to celebrate the 26th of April, which was a feast day in the village, as well as to celebrate his return. The guests whom he wished to be invited were, first, his sister, secondly, Monsieur Chaubard, whose pleasant disposition made him a welcome guest at all the village festivals, thirdly and fourthly, 2 neighbours, businessmen like himself, with whom he lived on terms of the friendliest intimacy. That was the party, and the family of Saidu took especial pains, as the time approached, to provide a supper worthy of the guests, who had all shown the heartiest readiness in accepting their invitations. This was the domestic position. These were the family prospects. On the morning of the 26th of April, a memorable day, for years afterward, in the village of Croix-du-Rade. 2. The events of the day. Besides the curacy of the village church, good Monsieur Chaubard held some ecclesiastical preferment in the cathedral church of St. Stephen at Toulouse. Early in the forenoon of the 26th, certain matters connected with this preferment took him from his village curacy to the city, a distance which has been already described as not greater than 1 French league, or between 2 and 3 English miles. After transacting his business, Monsieur Chaubard parted with his clerical brethren, who left him by himself in the sacristy or vestry of the church. Before he had quitted the room, in his turn, the beadle entered it, and inquired for the Abbé de Mariotte, one of the officiating priests attached to the cathedral. "The abbé has just gone out," replied Monsieur Chaubard. "Who wants him?" "A respectable-looking man," said the beadle. "I thought he seemed to be in some distress of mind when he spoke to me. Did he mention his business with the abbé?" "Yes, sir. He expressed himself as anxious to make his confession immediately." "In that case," said Monsieur Chaubard, "I may be of use to him in the abbé's absence, for I have authority to act here as confessor. Let us go into the church and see if this person feels disposed to accept my services." When they went into the church, they found the man walking backward and forward in a restless, disordered manner. His looks were so strikingly suggestive of some serious mental perturbation that Monsieur Chaubard found it no easy matter to preserve his composure when he first addressed himself to the stranger. "I am sorry," he began, "that the Abbé de Mariotte is not here to offer you his services." "I want to make my confession," said the man, looking about him vacantly, as if the priest's words had not attracted his attention. "You can do so at once, if you please," said Monsieur Chaubard. "I am attached to this church, and I possess the necessary authority to receive confessions in it. Perhaps, however, you are personally acquainted with the Abbé de Mariotte. Perhaps you would prefer waiting." "No," said the man, roughly. "I would as soon or sooner confess to a stranger." "In that case," replied Monsieur Chaubard, "be so good as to follow me." He led the way to the confessional. The beadle, whose curiosity was excited, waited a little and looked after them. In a few minutes he saw the curtains, which were sometimes used to conceal the face of the officiating priest, suddenly drawn. The penitent knelt with his back turned to the church. There was literally nothing to see, but the beadle waited, nevertheless, in expectation of the end. After a long lapse of time, the curtain was withdrawn, and priest and penitent left the confessional. The change which the interval had worked in Monsieur Chaubard was so extraordinary that the beadle's attention was altogether withdrawn, in the interest of observing it, from the man who had made the confession. He did not remark by which door the stranger left the church. His eyes were fixed on Monsieur Chaubard. The priest's naturally ruddy face was as white as if he had just risen from a long sickness. He looked straight before him, with a stare of terror, and he left the church as hurriedly as if he had been a man escaping from prison. Left it without a parting word or a farewell look. Although he was noted for his courtesy to his inferiors on all ordinary occasions. "Good Monsieur Chaubard has heard more than he bargained for," said the beadle, wandering back to the empty confessional with an interest which he had never felt in it till that moment. The day wore on as quietly as usual in the village of Croix-Daurade. At the appointed time, the supper table was laid for the guests in the house of Saturnin Siadou. The widow Mirailhe and the two neighbours arrived a little before sunset. Monsieur Chaubard, who was usually punctual, did not make his appearance with them, and when the daughters of Saturnin Siadou looked out from the upper windows, they saw no signs on the high road of their father's return. Sunset came, and still neither Siadou nor the priest appeared. The little party sat waiting round the table, and waited in vain. Before long, a message was sent up from the kitchen, representing that the supper must be eaten forthwith or be spoiled, and the company began to debate the two alternatives of waiting or not waiting any longer. "It is my belief," said the widow Mirailhe, "that my brother is not coming home tonight. When Monsieur Chaubard joins us, we had better sit down to supper." "Can any accident have happened to my father?" asked one of the two daughters anxiously. "God forbid!" said the widow. "God forbid!" repeated the two neighbours, looking expectantly at the empty supper table. "It has been a wretched day for travelling," said Louis, the eldest son. "It rained in torrents all yesterday," added Thomas, the second son. "And your father's rheumatism makes him averse to travelling in wet weather," suggested the widow thoughtfully. "Very true," said the first of the two neighbours, shaking his head piteously at his passive knife and fork. Another message came up from the kitchen, and peremptorily forbade the company to wait any longer. "But where is Monsieur Chaubard?" said the widow. "Has he been taking a journey too? Why is he absent? Has anybody seen him today?" "I have seen him today," said the youngest son, who had not spoken yet. This young man's name was Jean. He was little given to talking, but he had proved himself, on various domestic occasions, to be the quickest and most observant member of the family. "Where did you see him?" asked the widow. "I met him this morning, on his way into Toulouse. He has not fallen ill, I hope. Did he look out of sorts when you met him?" "He was in excellent health and spirits," said Jean. "I never saw him look better, and I never saw him look worse," said the second of the neighbours, striking into the conversation with the aggressive fretfulness of a hungry man. "What? This morning?" cried Jean in astonishment. "No, this afternoon," said the neighbor. "I saw him going into our church here. He was as white as our plates will be when they come up. And what is almost as extraordinary, he passed without taking the slightest notice of me." Jean relapsed into his customary silence. It was getting dark. The clouds had gathered while the company had been talking, and at the first pause in the conversation, the rain, falling again in torrents, made itself drearily audible. "Dear, dear me," said the widow. "If it was not raining so hard, we might send somebody to inquire after good Monsieur Chaubard." "I'll go and inquire," said Thomas Siadoux. "It's not 5 minutes' walk. Have up the supper. I'll take a cloak with me, and if our excellent Monsieur Chaubard is out of his bed, I'll bring him back to answer for himself." With those words he left the room. The supper was put on the table forthwith. The hungry neighbor disputed with nobody from that moment, and the melancholy neighbor recovered his spirits. On reaching the priest's house, Thomas Siadoux found him sitting alone in his study. He started to his feet with every appearance of the most violent alarm when the young man entered the room. "I beg your pardon, sir," said Thomas. "I am afraid I have startled you." "What do you want?" asked Monsieur Chaubard, in a singularly abrupt, bewildered manner. "Have you forgotten, sir, that this is the night of our supper?" remonstrated Thomas. "My father has not come back, and we can only suppose—" At those words, the priest dropped into his chair again, and trembled from head to foot. Amazed to the last degree by this extraordinary reception of his remonstrance, Thomas Siadoux remembered at the same time that he had engaged to bring Monsieur Chaubard back with him, and he determined to finish his civil speech as if nothing had happened. "We are all of opinion," he resumed, "that the weather has kept my father on the road. But that is no reason, sir, why the supper should be wasted, or why you should not make one of us. As you promised, here is a good warm cloak." "I can't come," said the priest. "I'm ill. I'm in bad spirits. I'm not fit to go out." He sighed bitterly and hid his face in his hands. "Don't say that, sir," persisted Thomas. "If you are out of spirits, let us try to cheer you. And you, in your turn, will enliven us. They are all waiting for you at home." "Don't refuse, sir," pleaded the young man, "or we shall think we have offended you in some way. You have always been a good friend to our family." Monsieur Chaubard again rose from his chair with a second change of manner, as extraordinary and as perplexing as the first. His eyes moistened as if the tears were rising in them. He took the hand of Thomas Siadoux and pressed it long and warmly in his own. There was a curious mixed expression of pity and fear in the look which he now fixed on the young man. "Of all the days in the year," he said very earnestly, "don't doubt my friendship today. Ill as I am, I will make one of the supper party for your sake. And for my father's sake," added Thomas persuasively. "Let us go to the supper," said the priest. Thomas Siadoux wrapped the cloak round him, and they left the house. Everyone at the table noticed the change in Monsieur Chaubard. He accounted for it by declaring confusedly that he was suffering from nervous illness, and then added that he would do his best, notwithstanding, to promote the social enjoyment of the evening. His talk was fragmentary, and his cheerfulness was sadly forced, but he contrived, with these drawbacks, to take his part in the conversation, except in the case when it happened to turn on the absent master of the house. Whenever the name of Saturnin Siadoux was mentioned either by the neighbors, who politely regretted that he was not present, or by the family, who naturally talked about the resting place which he might have chosen for the night, Monsieur Chaubard either relapsed into blank silence or abruptly changed the topic. Under these circumstances, the company, by whom he was respected and beloved, made the necessary allowances for his state of health, the only person among them who showed no desire to cheer the priest's spirits and to humour him in his temporary fretfulness, being the silent younger son of Saturnin Siadu. Both Louis and Thomas noticed that, from the moment when Monsieur Chaubart's manner first betrayed his singular unwillingness to touch on the subject of their father's absence, Jean fixed his eyes on the priest with an expression of suspicious attention, and never looked away from him for the rest of the evening. The young man's absolute silence at table did not surprise his brothers, for they were accustomed to his taciturn habits. But the sullen distrust betrayed in his close observation of the honoured guest and friend of the family surprised and angered them. The priest himself seemed once or twice to be aware of the scrutiny to which he was subjected, and to feel uneasy and offended, as he naturally might. He abstained, however, from openly noticing Jean's strange behaviour, and Louis and Thomas were bound, therefore, in common politeness, to abstain from noticing it also. The inhabitants of Quadorade kept early hours. Toward 11 o'clock, the company rose and separated for the night. Except the two neighbours, nobody had enjoyed the supper, and even the two neighbours, having eaten their fill, were as glad to get home as the rest. In the little confusion of parting, Monsieur Chaubart completed the astonishment of the guests at the extraordinary change in him by slipping away alone without waiting to bid anybody good night. The widow Mireillehe and her nieces withdrew to their bedrooms and left the three brothers by themselves in the parlour. "Jane," said Thomas Siadoux, "I have a word to say to you." "You stared at our good Monsieur Chaubart in a very offensive manner all through the evening. What did you mean by it?" "Wait till tomorrow," said Jean, "and perhaps I may tell you." He lit his candle and left them. Both the brothers observed that his hand trembled, and that his manner, never very winning, was on that night more serious and more unsociable than usual. Sir, the younger brother. When post-time came on the morning of the 27th, no letter arrived from Saturnin Siadoux. On consideration, the family interpreted this circumstance in a favourable light. If the master of the house had not written to them, it followed, surely, that he meant to make writing unnecessary by returning on that day. As the hours passed, the widow and her nieces looked out from time to time for the absent man. Toward noon, they observed a little assembly of people approaching the village. Ere long, on a nearer view, they recognized at the head of the assembly the chief magistrate of Toulouse in his official dress. He was accompanied by his assessor, also in official dress, by an escort of archers, and by certain subordinates attached to the town hall. These last appeared to be carrying some burden, which was hidden from view by the escort of archers. The procession stopped at the house of Saturnin Siadoux, and the two daughters, hastening to the door to discover what had happened, met the burden which the men were carrying, and saw, stretched on a litter, the dead body of their father. The corpse had been found that morning on the banks of the river Lers. It was stabbed in 11 places with knife or dagger wounds. None of the valuables about the dead man's person had been touched. His watch and his money were still in his pockets. Whoever had murdered him for vengeance, not for gain. Some time elapsed before even the male members of the family were sufficiently composed to hear what the officers of justice had to say to them. When this result had been at length achieved, and when the necessary inquiries had been made, no information of any kind was obtained which pointed to the murderer, in the eye of the law. After expressing his sympathy, and promising that every available means should be tried to effect the discovery of the criminal, the chief magistrate gave his orders to his escort, and withdrew. When night came, the sister and the daughters of the murdered man retired to the upper part of the house, exhausted by the violence of their grief. The three brothers were left once more alone in the parlour to speak together of the awful calamity which had befallen them. They were of hot southern blood, and they looked on one another with a southern thirst for vengeance in their tearless eyes. The silent younger son was now the first to open his lips. "You charged me yesterday," he said to his brother Thomas, "with looking strangely at Monsieur Chaubard all the evening, and I answered, that I might tell you why I looked at him when tomorrow came. Tomorrow has come, and I am ready to tell you." He waited a little, and lowered his voice to a whisper when he spoke again. "When Monsieur Chaubard was at our supper table last night," he said, "I had it in my mind that something had happened to our father, and that the priest knew it." The two elder brothers looked at him in speechless astonishment. "Our father has been brought back to us a murdered man," Jean went on, still in a whisper. "I tell you, Louis and you, Thomas, that the priest knows who murdered him." Louis and Thomas shrank from their younger brother as if he had spoken blasphemy. "Listen," said Jean. "No clue has been found to the secret of the murder. The magistrate has promised us to do his best, but I saw in his face that he had little hope. We must make the discovery ourselves, or our father's blood will have cried to us for vengeance and cried in vain. Remember that, and mark my next words. You heard me say yesterday evening that I had met Monsieur Chaubard on his way to Toulouse in excellent health and spirits. You heard our old friend and neighbour contradict me at the supper table, and declare that he had seen the priest. Some hours later, go into our church here with the face of a panic-stricken man. You saw, Thomas, how he behaved when you went to fetch him to our house. You saw, Louis, what his looks were like when he came in. The change was noticed by everybody. What was the cause of it? I saw the cause in the priest's own face when our father's name turned up in the talk round the supper table. Did Monsieur Chaubard join in that talk? He was the only person present who never joined in it once. Did he change it on a sudden whenever it came his way? It came his way 4 times, and 4 times he changed it, trembling, stammering, turning whiter and whiter, but still as true as the heaven above us, shifting the talk off himself every time. Are you men? Have you brains in your heads? Don't you see, as I see, what this leads to? On my salvation I swear it, the priest knows the hand that killed our father. The faces of the 2 elder brothers darkened vindictively as the conviction of the truth fastened itself on their minds. "How could he know it?" they inquired eagerly. "He must tell us himself," said Jean. "And if he hesitates, if he refuses to open his lips, we must open them by main force." They drew their chairs together after that last answer and consulted for some time in whispers. When the consultation was over, the brothers rose and went into the room where the dead body of their father was laid out. The 3 kissed him in turn on the forehead, then took hands together and looked meaningly in each other's faces, then separated. Louis and Thomas put on their hats and went at once to the priest's residence, while Jean withdrew by himself to the great room at the back of the house, which was used for the purposes of the oil factory. Only one of the workmen was left in the place. He was watching an immense cauldron of boiling linseed oil. "You can go home," said Jean, patting the man kindly on the shoulder. "There is no hope of a night's rest for me. After the affliction that has befallen us, I will take your place at the cauldron. Go home, my good fellow, go home." The man thanked him and withdrew. Jean followed and satisfied himself that the workman had really left the house. He then returned and sat down by the boiling cauldron. Meanwhile, Louis and Thomas presented themselves at the priest's house. He had not yet retired to bed, and he received them kindly, but with the same extraordinary agitation in his face and manner which had surprised all who saw him on the previous day. The brothers were prepared beforehand with an answer when he inquired what they wanted of him. They replied immediately that the shock of their father's horrible death had so seriously affected their aunt and their eldest sister that it was feared the minds of both might give way, unless spiritual consolation and assistance were afforded to them that night. The unhappy priest, always faithful and self-sacrificing where the duties of his ministry were in question at once, rose to accompany the young men back to the house. He even put on his surplice and took the crucifix with him to impress his words of comfort all the more solemnly on the afflicted women whom he was called on to succor. Thus, innocent of all suspicion of the conspiracy to which he had fallen a victim, he was taken into the room where Jean sat waiting by the cauldron of oil, and the door was locked behind him. Before he could speak, Thomas Siadoux openly avowed the truth. "It is we three who want you," he said, "not our aunt, and not our sister. If you answer our questions truly, you have nothing to fear. If you refuse—" He stopped and looked toward Jean and the boiling cauldron. Never, at the best of times, a resolute man, deprived, since the day before, of such resources of energy as he possessed, by the mental suffering which he had undergone in secret. The unfortunate priest trembled from head to foot as the three brothers closed round him. Louis took the crucifix from him and held it. Thomas forced him to place his right hand on it. Jean stood in front of him and put the questions. "Our father has been brought home a murdered man," he said. "Do you know who killed him?" The priest hesitated, and the two elder brothers moved him nearer to the cauldron. "Answer us, on peril of your life," said Jean. "Say, with your hand on the blessed crucifix, do you know the man who killed our father?" "I do know him." "When did you make the discovery?" "Yesterday." "Where?" "At Toulouse." "Name the murderer." At those words, the priest closed his hand fast on the crucifix and rallied his sinking courage. "Never," he said firmly. "The knowledge I possess was obtained in the confessional. The secrets of the confessional are sacred. If I betray them, I commit sacrilege. I will die first." "Think," said Jean. "If you keep silence, you screen the murderer. If you keep silence, you are the murderer's accomplice. We have sworn over our father's dead body to avenge him. If you refuse to speak, we will avenge him on you. I charge you again, name the man who killed him." "I will die first," the priest reiterated as firmly as before. "Die then," said Jean. "Die in that cauldron of boiling oil?" "Give him time," cried Louis and Thomas, earnestly pleading together. "We will give him time," said the younger brother. "There is the clock yonder, against the wall. We will count 5 minutes by it. In those 5 minutes, let him make his peace with God, or make up his mind to speak." They waited, watching the clock. In that dreadful interval, the priest dropped on his knees and hid his face. The time passed in dead silence. "Speak, for your own sake, for our sakes, speak," said Thomas Siadoux, as the minute hand reached the point at which the 5 minutes expired. The priest looked up. His voice died away on his lips. The mortal agony broke out on his face in great drops of sweat. His head sank forward on his breast. "Lift him!" cried Jean, seizing the priest on one side. "Lift him and throw him in!" The two elder brothers advanced a step and hesitated. "Lift him, on your oath over our father's body." The two brothers seized him on the other side. As they lifted him to a level with the cauldron, the horror of the death that threatened him burst from the lips of the miserable man in a scream of terror. The brothers held him firm at the cauldron's edge. "Name the man," they said for the last time. The priest's teeth chattered. He was speechless, but he made a sign with his head, a sign in the affirmative. They placed him in a chair and waited patiently until he was able to speak. His first words were words of entreaty. He begged Thomas Siadoux to give him back the crucifix. When it was placed in his possession, he kissed it and said faintly, "I ask pardon of God for the sin that I am about to commit." He paused, and then looked up at the younger brother, who still stood in front of him. "I am ready," he said. "Question me, and I will answer." Jean repeated the questions which he had put when the priest was first brought into the room. "You know the murderer of our father?" "I know him." "Since when?" "Since he made his confession to me yesterday in the Cathedral of Toulouse." "Name him." "His name is Cantegrel." "The man who wanted to marry our aunt?" "The same." "What brought him to the confessional?" "His own remorse." "What were the motives for his crime?" "There were reports against his character, and he discovered that your father had gone privately to Narbonne to make sure they were true." "Did our father make sure of their truth?" "He did." "Would those discoveries have separated our aunt from Cantegrel if our father had lived to tell her of them?" "They would." "If your father had lived, he would have told your aunt that Cantegrel was married already, that he had deserted his wife at Narbonne, that she was living there with another man, under another name, and that she had herself confessed it in your father's presence." "Where was the murder committed, between Villefranche and this village?" "Cantegrel had followed your father to Narbonne, and had followed him back again to Villefranche. As far as that place he travelled in company with others, both going and returning. Beyond Villefranche, he was left alone at the ford over the river. There, Cantegrel drew the knife to kill him before he reached home and told his news to your aunt." "How was the murder committed?" "It was committed while your father was watering his pony by the bank of the stream. Cantegrel stole on him from behind and struck him as he was stooping over the saddlebow." "This is the truth, on your oath?" "On my oath, it is the truth. You may leave us." The priest rose from his chair without assistance. From the time when the terror of death had forced him to reveal the murderer's name, a great change had passed over him. He had given his answers with the immovable calmness of a man on whose mind all human interests had lost their hold. He now left the room, strangely absorbed in himself, moving with the mechanical regularity of a sleepwalker, lost to all perception of things and persons about him. At the door, he stopped, woke, as it seemed, from the trance that possessed him, and looked at the three brothers with a steady, changeless sorrow which they had never seen in him before, which they never afterward forgot. "I forgive you," he said quietly and solemnly. "Pray for me when my time comes." With those last words, he left them. IV. The End. The night was far advanced, but the three brothers determined to set forth instantly for Toulouse, and to place their information in the magistrate's hands before the morning dawned. Thus far, no suspicion had occurred to them of the terrible consequences which were to follow their night interview with the priest. They were absolutely ignorant of the punishment to which a man in holy orders exposed himself if he revealed the secrets of the confessional. No infliction of that punishment had been known in their neighborhood, for at that time, as at this, the rarest of all priestly offences was a violation of the sacred trust confided to the confessor by the Roman Church. Conscious that they had forced the priest into the commission of a clerical offence, the brothers sincerely believed that the loss of his curacy would be the heaviest penalty which the law could exact from him. They entered Toulouse that night, discussing the atonement which they might offer to Monsieur Chaubard, and the means which they might best employ to make his future easy to him. The first disclosure of the consequences which would certainly follow the outrage they had committed was revealed to them when they made their deposition before the officer of justice. The magistrate listened to their narrative with horror, vividly expressed in his face and manner. "Better you had never been born," he said, "than have avenged your father's death as you three have avenged it. Your own act has doomed the guilty and the innocent to suffer alike." Those words proved prophetic of the truth. The end came quickly, as the priest had foreseen it when he spoke his parting words. The arrest of Cantegrel was accomplished without difficulty the next morning. In the absence of any other evidence on which to justify this proceeding, the private disclosure to the authorities of the secret which the priest had violated became inevitable. The Parliament of Languedoc was, under these circumstances, the tribunal appealed to, and the decision of that assembly immediately ordered the priest and the three brothers to be placed in confinement, as well as the murderer Cantegrel. Evidence was then immediately sought for, which might convict this last criminal without any reference to the revelation that had been forced from the priest, and evidence enough was found to satisfy judges whose minds already possessed the foregone certainty of the prisoner's guilt. He was put on his trial, was convicted of the murder, and was condemned to be broken on the wheel. The sentence was rigidly executed, with as little delay as the law would permit. The cases of Monsieur Chaubard and of the three sons of Siadou next occupied the judges. The three brothers were found guilty of having forced the secret of a confession from a man in holy orders, and were sentenced to death by hanging. A far more terrible expiation of his offence awaited the unfortunate priest. He was condemned to have his limbs broken on the wheel, and to be afterward, while still living, bound to the stake and destroyed by fire. Barbarous as the punishments of that period were, accustomed as the population was to hear of their infliction and even to witness it, the sentences pronounced in these two cases dismayed the public mind, and the authorities were surprised by receiving petitions for mercy from Toulouse and from all the surrounding neighborhood. But the priest's doom had been sealed. All that could be obtained by the intercession of persons of the highest distinction was that the executioner should grant him the mercy of death before his body was committed to the flames. With this one modification, the sentence was executed, as the sentence had been pronounced, on the curate of Croix-d'Audet. The punishment of the three sons of Siadou remained to be inflicted, but the people, roused by the death of the ill-fated priest, rose against this third execution with a resolution before which the local government gave way. The cause of the young men was taken up by the hot-blooded populace, as the cause of all fathers and all sons. Their filial piety was exalted to the skies. Their youth was pleaded in their behalf. Their ignorance of the terrible responsibility which they had confronted in forcing the secret from the priest was loudly alleged in their favor. More than this, the authorities were actually warned that the appearance of the prisoners on the scaffold would be the signal for an organized revolt and rescue. Under this serious pressure, the execution was deferred, and the prisoners were kept in confinement until the popular ferment had subsided. The delay not only saved their lives, it gave them back their liberty as well. The infection of the popular sympathy had penetrated through the prison doors. All three brothers were handsome, well-grown young men. The gentlest of the three in disposition, Thomas Siadou, aroused the interest and won the affection of the head jailer's daughter. Her father was prevailed on at her intercession to relax a little in his customary vigilance, and the rest was accomplished by the girl herself. One morning, the population of Toulouse heard, with every testimony of the most extravagant rejoicing, that the three brothers had escaped, accompanied by the jailer's daughter. As a necessary legal formality, they were pursued, but no extraordinary efforts were used to overtake them, and they succeeded accordingly in crossing the nearest frontier. 20 days later, Orders were received from the capital to execute their sentence in effigy. They were then permitted to return to France, on condition that they never again appeared in their native place, or in any other part of the province of Languedoc. With this reservation they were left free to live where they pleased, and to repent the fatal act which had avenged them on the murderer of their father at the cost of the priest's life. Beyond this point, the official documents do not enable us to follow their career. All that is now known has been now told of the village tragedy at Croix d'Aurore. The burial at the tide. It was a fine morning in the autumn of, and the sun had not yet robbed the grass of its dew, as a stout-built peasant was moving briskly along a small by-road in the county of Tipperary. The elasticity of his step bespoke the lightness of his heart, and the rapidity of his walk did not seem sufficient even for the exuberance of his glee. For every now and then the walk was exchanged for a sort of dancing shuffle, which terminated with a short capering kick that threw up the dust about him. And all the while he whistled one of those whimsical jig tunes with which Ireland abounds, and twirled his stick over his head in a triumphal flourish. Then off he started again in his original pace, and hummed a rollicking song, and occasionally broke out into soliloquy. "Why, then, and isn't it the great day entirely for Ireland? That is in it this blessed day. Woo, your soul to glory, but well do the job complete." And here he cut a caper. "Divil a more they'll ever get, and it's only a pity they ever got any. But there's an end of them now, they're cut down from this out." And here he made an appropriate downstroke of his shillelah through a bunch of thistles that skirted the road. "Where will be their grand doings now, eh?" "I'd like to know that." "Where'll be their lazy livery servants? Ow! Ow!" And he sprang lightly over a stile. "And what will they do for their coaches and four?" Here, a lark sprang up at his feet and darted into the air with its thrilling rush of exquisite melody. "Faith, you've given me my answer sure enough, my purty lark. That's as much as to say they may go whistle for them. Oh, my poor fellows, how I pity yez." And here he broke into a too-ray-la-loo, and danced along the path. Then suddenly dropping into silence, he resumed his walk, and applying his hand behind his head, cocked up his corbane and began to rub behind his ear, according to the most approved peasant practice of assisting the powers of reflection. "Faix, an, it's myself that's puzzled to know what'll the procthors and the process sarvers and praisers do at all. By gorra, they must go robbing the road, since they won't be let to rob any more in the fields. Robbing is all that is left for them. For sure they couldn't turn to any honest thrade after the courses they have been used to. Oh, what a power, oh! Miscreants will be out of bread for the want of their old thrade of false swearing. Why, the vagabonds will be lost, Baron. They're sent to bot. And indeed, if a bridge could be built of false oaths, by my soukins, they could swear themselves there without wetting their feet." Here he overtook another peasant, whom he accosted with the universal salutation of "God save you." "God save you kindly," was returned for answer. "And is it yourself that's there, Mikey Noonan?" said the one first introduced to the reader. "Indeed, it's myself and nobody else," said Noonan. "And where is it you're going this fine morning?" "And is it yourself that's axing? That same Mikey? Why, where is it I would be going but to the Baron?" "I thought so in troth. It's yourself that is always ripe and ready for fun, and small blame to me." Why, then, it was a mighty complete thing, whoever it was, that thought of making a Baron out of it. And don't you know? Not to my knowledge. Why, then, who would you think now laid it all out? Faix, I dunna, maybe 'twas Pether Connolly. No, It wasn't, though Pether's a cute chap guess again. Well, was it Phil Mulligan? No, it wasn't, though you made a good offer at it sure enough, for if it wasn't Phil, it was his sister. Tear alive, is it? Biddy it was. Score to the one else. Oh, she's the queerest crather in life. There's not a thrick out, that one's not up to, and more besides. By the powders o' war, she'd bait a field full o' lawyers at Scummin. She's the divil's biddy. By thin, but it was a great idea entirely. You may say that in troth, maybe it's we won't have the fun, but see who's before us there. Isn't it that old Coogan? Sure enough, by dad. Why thin, isn't he, the rail fine old cock, to come so far to see the rights of the thing? Fakes? He was always the right sort, sure, in '98, as I hear. He was mouth-rated a power, and his place rummaged, and himself a most kilt. Beccassy, he wouldn't inform on his neighbours. God's blessing be in him, and the likes of him that wouldn't prove traitor to a friend in distress. Here they came up with the old man to whom they alluded. He was the remains of a stately figure, and his white hair hung at some length round the back of his head and his temples, while a black and well-marked eyebrow overshadowed his keen grey eye. The contrast of the dark eyebrow to the white hair rendered the intelligent cast of his features more striking, and he was, altogether, a figure that one would not be likely to pass without notice. He was riding a small horse at an easy pace, and he answered the rather respectful salutation of the 2-foot passengers with kindness and freedom. They addressed him as Mr. Coogan, while to them he returned the familiar term boys. And av course, it's going to the berrin you are, Mr. Coogan, and long life to you. Aye, boys, it's hard for an old horse to leave off his thricks. How old is it? Fakes, and it's yourself that has more heart in you this blessed morning than many a man that's not half your age. By dad, I'm not a colt, boys, though I kick up my heels sometimes. Well, you'll never do it younger, sir, but sure, why wouldn't you be there when all the country is going? I hear, and no wonder sure. By the hole in my hat it's enough, so it is, to make a sick man lave his bed to see the fun that'll be in it. And sure it's right and proper, and shows the spirit that's in the country, when a man like yourself, Mr. Coogan, joins the poor people in doing it. I like to stand up for the right, answered the old man. And always was a good warrant to do that same, said Larry, in his most laudatory tone. Will you tell us who's that, for instance, and the road there? Asked the old man, as he pointed to a person that seemed to make his way with some difficulty, for he laboured under an infirmity of limb that caused a grotesque jerking action in his walk, if walk it might be called. Why, thin, don't you know him, Mr. Coogan? By dad, I thought there wasn't a parish in the country that didn't know poor Hoppy Hooligan. It has been often observed before, the love of sobriquet that the Irish possess. But let it not be supposed that their nicknames are given in a spirit of unkindness, far from it. A sense of the ridiculous is so closely interwoven in an Irishman's nature that he will even jest upon his own misfortunes, and while he indulges in a joke, one of the few indulgences he can command, the person that excites it may as frequently be the object of his open-heartedness as his mirth. And is that Hoppy Hooligan? Said old Coogan. I often heard of him, to be sure, but I never seen him before. Oh, then, you may see him before and behind now, said Larry. And, indeed, if he had a match for that odd skirt of his coat, he wouldn't be the worse of it. And in troth the corduroys themselves aren't a bit too good. And there's the lasted taste in life of his. Wisht, said the old man, he is looking back, and maybe he hears you. Not he in troth. Sure he's partly bothered. How can he play the fiddle then, and be bothered? Said Coogan. Fakes, and that's the very reason he is bothered. Sure, he moiters the ears off of him entirely with the noise of his own fiddle. Oh, he's a powerful fiddler." "So I often heard, indeed," said the old man. "He bangs all the fiddlers in the country." "And is in the greatest request," added Noonan. "Yet he looks tethered enough," said old Coogan. "Sure you never seen a well-dressed fiddler yet," said Larry. "Indeed, and now you remind me, I believe not," said the old man. "I suppose they all get more kicks than happens, as the saying is." "Divil a many kicks Hooligan gets. He's a great favourite entirely." "Why is he in such distress, then?" asked Coogan. "Faith, he's not in distress at all. He's welcome everywhere he goes, and has the best of atin and drinking the place affords wherever he is, and picks up the coppers fast at the fairs, and is no way necessitated in life, though indeed it can't be denied, as he limps along there, that he has a great many ups and downs in the world." This person, of whom the preceding dialogue treats, was a celebrated fiddler in these parts, and his familiar name of Hoppy Hooligan was acquired, as the reader may already have perceived, from his limping gait. This limp was the consequence of a broken leg, which was one of the consequences of an affray, which is the certain consequence of a fair in Tipperary. Hooligan was a highly characteristic specimen of an Irish fiddler. As Larry Lanigan said, "You never seen a well-dressed fiddler yet," but Hooligan was a particularly ill-fledged bird of the musical tribe. His corduroys have already been hinted at by Larry, as well as his coat, which had lost half the skirt, thereby partially revealing the aforesaid corduroys. Or, if one might be permitted to indulge in an image, the half-skirt that remained served to produce a partial eclipse of the disc of corduroy. This was what we painters call picturesque. By the way, the vulgar are always amazed that some tattered remains of anything is more prized by the painter than the freshest production in all its gloss of novelty. The fiddler's stockings, too, in the neglected falling of their folds round his leg, and the wisp of straw that fringed the opening of his gaping brogues, were valuable additions to the picture. And his hat. But stop, let me not presume his hat. It would be a vain attempt to describe. There are two things not to be described, which, to know what they are, you must see. These two things are Taglioni's dancing and an Irish fiddler's hat. The one is a wonder in action, the other an enigma in form. Hooligan's fiddle was as great a curiosity as himself, and, like its master, somewhat the worse for wear. It had been broken some score of times, and yet, by dint of glue, was continued in what an antiquary would call a fine state of preservation. That is to say, there was rather more of glue than wood in the article. The stringing of the instrument was as great a piece of patchwork as itself, and exhibited great ingenuity on the part of its owner. Many was the knot above the fingerboard and below the bridge, that is, when the fiddle was in the best order, for in case of fractures on the field of action, that is to say at wake, patron, or fair, where the fiddler, unlike the girl he was playing for, had not two strings to his bow. In such case, I say, the old string should be knotted wherever it might require to be, and I have heard it insinuated that the music was not a bit the worse of it. Indeed, the only economy that poor Hooligan ever practised was in the strings of his fiddle, and those were an admirable exemplification of the proverb of making both ends meet. Hooligan's waistcoat, too, was a curiosity, or rather a cabinet of curiosities, for he appropriated its pockets to various purposes: snuff, resin, tobacco, a clasp knife with half a blade, a piece of flint, a dudeen, and some bits of twine and ends of fiddle strings were all huddled together promiscuously. Hooligan himself called his waistcoat Noah's Ark, for, as he said himself, there was a little of everything in it, barring money, and that would never stay in his company. His fiddle, partly enfolded in a scanty bit of old baize, was tucked under his left arm, and his right was employed in helping him to hobble along by means of a black thorn stick. When he was overtaken by the 3 travellers already named and saluted by all, with the addition of a query as to where he was going. "Where would I be going?" "But to the Berrin," said Hooligan. "Throth." "It's the same answer I expected," said Lanigan. "It would be nothing at all without you." "I've played at many a wedding," said Hooligan, "but I'm thinking there will be more fun at this Berrin than any 10 weddings." "Indeed you may say that, Hoppy, Agra," said Noonan. "Why thin, Hoppy Jewel," said Lanigan. "What did the skirt of your coat do to you that you left it behind you and wouldn't let it see the fun?" "'Deed, then I'll tell you, Larry, my boy. I was going last night by the by-road that runs up at the back of the old house, nigh hand the Widdy Casey's, and I heard that people was living in it since I travelled the road last, and so I opened the old iron gate that was as stiff in the hinge as a miser's fist, and the road laden, up to the house, looking as lonely as a churchyard, and the grass growing out through it, and says I to myself, I'm thinking it's few darkens you doors, says I. God be with the time the old squire was here, that stayed at home and didn't go abroad out of his own country, letting the fine stately old place go to rack and ruin and fakes. I was turning back, and I wish I did, when I seen a man coming down the road, and so I waited till he came up to me, and I asked if anyone was up at the house. Yes, says he, and with that I heard terrible barking entirely, and a great big lump of a dog turned the corner of the house and stood growling at me. I'm afeard there's dogs in it, says I to the man. Yes, says he, but they're quite quiet. So with that I went my way, and he went his way, but my jewel, the minute I got into the yard, 9 great vagabonds of dogs fell on me, and I thought they'd ate me alive, and so they would, I believe, only I had a cowled bones o' mate and some pratties that Mrs. McGrain, God bless her, made me put in my pocket when I was going the road as I was laving her house that morning, after the christening that was in it, and sure enough, lashings and lavings was there. Oh, that's the woman has a heart as big as a king's, and her husband too. In troth, he's a decent man and keeps mighty fine drink in his house. Well, as I was saying, the cowled mate and pratties was in my pocket, and by gore, the thieving, morridin villains o' dogs made a dart at the pocket and dragged it clan off, and thin, my dear, with fighting among themselves, thriving. To come at the mate, the skirt of my coat was in smid-hereens in 1 minute divil. A lie in it, not a tather of it was left together, and it's only a wonder I came off with my life. Faith, I think so, said Lanigan. And wasn't it mighty providential they didn't come at the fiddle? Sure, what would the country do then? Sure enough, you may say that, said Hooligan. And then my bread would be gone as well as my mate. But think the unnatural vagabone that told me the dogs was quite. Sure he came back while I was there, and I ups and I told him what a shame it was to tell me the dogs was quite. So they are quite, says he. Sure there's 9 of them, and only 7 of them bites. Thank you, says I. There was something irresistibly comic in the quiet manner that Hooligan said, "Thank you," says I, and the account of his canine adventure altogether excited much mirth amongst his auditors. As they pursued their journey, many a joke was passed and repartee returned, and the laugh rang loudly and often from the merry little group as they trudged along. In the course of the next mile's march their numbers were increased by some half-dozen, that, one by one, suddenly appeared, by leaping over the hedge on the road, or crossing a stile from some neighbouring path. All these newcomers pursued the same route, and each gave the same answer when asked where he was going. It was universally this, Why then, where would I be going but to the Berrin? At a neighbouring confluence of roads, straggling parties of from 4 to 5 were seen in advance, and approaching in the rear, and the highway soon began to wear the appearance it is wont to do on the occasion of a patron, a fair, or a market day. Larry Lanigan was in evident enjoyment at this increase of numbers, and as the crowd thickened his exultation increased, and he often repeated his ejaculation, already noticed in Larry's opening soliloquy. "Why?" Then, "And isn't it a great day entirely for Ireland?" And now horsemen were more frequently appearing, and their numbers soon amounted to almost a cavalcade, and sometimes a car. That is to say, the car, common to the country for agricultural purposes, might be seen bearing a cargo of women, videlicet, the good woman, herself, and her rosy-cheeked daughters, and maybe a cousin or two, with an aide-de-camp aunt to assist in looking after the young ladies. The roughness of the motion of this primitive vehicle was rendered as accommodating as possible to the gentler sex by a plentiful shakedown of clean straw on the car, over which a feather bed was laid, and the best quilt in the house over that, to make all smart, possibly a piece of hexagon patchwork of the mistress herself, in which the tawdriest calico patterns served to display the taste of the rural seamstress, and stimulated the rising generation to feats of needlework. The car was always provided with a driver, who took such care upon himself. For a reason he was almost universally what is called in Ireland a clane boy. That is to say, a well-made, good-looking young fellow, whose eyes were not put into his head for nothing, and these same eyes might be seen wandering backwards occasionally from his immediate charge, the dumb baste, to take a squint at some, or maybe one, of his passengers. This explains the reason he had for becoming driver. Sometimes he sat on the crupper of the horse, resting his feet on the shafts of the car, and bending down his head to say something tender to the colleen that sat next him, totally negligent of his duty as guide. Sometimes, when the girl he wanted to be sweet on was seated at the back of the car, this relieved the horse from the additional burthen of his driver, and the claim boy would leave the horse's head and fall in the rear to delude of the crather, depending on the occasional hup or whoa for the guidance of the baste, when a too near proximity to the dyke by the roadside warned him of the necessity of his interference. Sometimes he was called to his duty by the open remonstrance of either the mother or the aunt, or maybe a mischievous cousin, as thus, "Why then, Dinny, what are you about at all? God betune me and harm, if you warn't within an inch of putting us all in the gripe of the ditch, arrah. Leave off your gosterin there, and mind the horse, will you? A purty thing it 'ud be if my bones was brook. What are you doing? There at all, at the back of the car, when it's at the baste's head you ought to be? Arrah, sure the baste knows the way herself." "Faix, I believe so, for it's little beholden to you she is for showing her." "Och, murther! There we are in the gripe a'most. Lave off your screeching, can't you, and be quiet. Sure, the poor crather only just wint over to get a mouthful of the grass by the side of the ditch. What business has she to be aidin' now? Becassie, she's hungry, I suppose. And why isn't she fed better? Becassie rogue stales her oats, dinny. I seen you in the stable by the same token yesterday." "Sure enough, mum, for I went there to look for my colt that was missing." "I thought it was the filly you were after, Dinny," said a cousin with a wink, and Dinny grinned, and his sweetheart blushed, while the rest of the girls tittered, the mother pretending not to hear the joke and bidding Dinny go mind his business by attending to the horse. But lest I should tire my reader by keeping him so long on the road, I will let him find the rest of his way, as well as he can, to a certain romantic little valley, where a comfortable farmhouse was situated beside a small mountain stream that tumbled along noisily over its rocky bed, and in which some ducks, noisier than the stream, were enjoying their morning bath. The geese were indulging in dignified rest and silence upon the bank. A cock was crowing and strutting with his usual swagger amongst his hens. A pig was endeavouring to save his ears, not from this rural tumult, but from the teeth of a half-terrier dog, who was chasing him away from an iron pot full of potatoes, which the pig had dared to attempt some impertinent liberties with. And a girl was bearing into the house a pail of milk which she had just taken from the cow that stood placidly looking on, an admirable contrast to the general bustle of the scene. Everything about the cottage gave evidence of comfort on the part of its owner, and, to judge from the numbers without and within the house, you would say he did not want for friends, for all, as they arrived at its door, greeted Phelim O'Hara kindly, and Phelim welcomed each newcomer with a heartiness that did honour to his grey hairs. Frequently passing to and fro, busily engaged in arranging an ample breakfast in the barn, appeared his daughter, a pretty round-faced girl with black hair and the long and silky lashed dark grey eyes of her country, where merriment loves to dwell, and a rosy mouth, whose smiles served at once to display her good temper and her fine teeth. Her colour gets fresher for a moment, and a look of affectionate recognition brightens her eye as a lithe young fellow springs briskly over the stepping-stones that lead across the stream, and trips lightly up to the girl, who offers her hand in welcome. Who is the happy dog that is so well received by Honor O'Hara, the prettiest girl in that parish, or the next, and the daughter of a snug man into the bargain? It is the reader's old acquaintance, Larry Lanigan. And maybe Larry did not give a squeeze extraordinary to the hand that was presented to him. The father received him well also. Indeed, for that matter, the difficulty would have been to find a house in the whole district that Larry would not have been welcome in. "So here you are at last, Larry," said old O'Hara. "I was wondering you were not here long ago." "And so I would. I thank you kindly," said Larry. "Only I overtook old Hoppy here, on the road, and sure I thought I might as well take my time and wait for poor Hoppy, and bring my welcome along with me." And here he shoved the fiddler into the house before him. "The girls will be glad to see the pair o' yees," said the old man, following. The interior of the house was crowded with guests, and the usual laughing and courting so often described as common to such assemblages were going forward amongst the young people. At the farther end of the largest room in the cottage, a knot of the older men of the party was engaged in the discussion of some subject that seemed to carry deep interest along with it. And at the opposite extremity of the same room, a coffin of very rude construction lay on a small table. And around this coffin stood all the junior part of the company, male and female, and the wildness of their mirth and the fertility of their jests over this tenement of mortality and its contents might have well startled a stranger for a moment, until he saw the nature of the deposit the coffin contained. Enshrouded in a sheaf of wheat lay a pig, between whose open jaws a large potato was placed, and the coffin was otherwise grotesquely decorated. The reader will wonder, no doubt, at such an exhibition, for certainly never was coffin so applied before, and it is therefore necessary to explain the meaning of all this, and I believe Ireland is the only country in the world where the facts I am about to relate could have occurred. It may be remembered that some time previously to the date at which my story commences, His Majesty's ministers declared that there should be a total extinction of tithes. This declaration was received in Ireland by the great mass of the people with the utmost delight, as they fancied they should never have tithes to pay again. The peasantry in the neighbourhood of Templemore formed the very original idea of burying the tithe. It is only amongst an imaginative people that such a notion could have originated, And indeed, there is something highly poetical in the conception. The tithe, that which the poor felt the keenest, that which they considered a tax on their industry, that which they looked upon as an hereditary oppression, that hateful thing, they were told, was to be extinct. And, in joyous anticipation of the blessing, they determined to enact an emblematic interment of this terrible enemy. I think it is not too much to call this idea a fine one, and yet, in the execution of it, they invested it with the broadest marking of the grotesque. Such is the strange compound of an Irish peasant whose anger is often vented in a jest, and whose mirth is sometimes terrible. I must here pause for a moment and request it to be distinctly understood that, in relating this story, in giving the facts connected with it, and in stating what the Irish peasant's feelings are respecting tithe, I have not the most distant notion of putting forward any opinions of my own on the subject. In the pursuit of my own quiet art, I am happily far removed from the fierce encounter of politics, and I do not wish to offend against the feelings or opinions of anyone in my little volume. And I trust, therefore, that I may be permitted to give a sketch of a characteristic incident as it came to my knowledge, without being mistaken for a partisan. I tell the tale as 'twas told to me. I have said a group of seniors was collected at one end of the room, and, as it is meet to give precedence to age, I will endeavour to give some idea of what was going forward amongst them. There was one old man of the party whose furrowed forehead, compressed eyebrows, peaked nose, and mouth, depressed at the corners, at once indicated to a physiognomist a querulous temper. He was one of your doubters upon all occasions, one of the unfailing elements of an argument, as he said himself. He was dubersome about everything, and he had hence earned the name of Daddy Dubersome amongst his neighbours. Well, Daddy began to doubt the probability that any such boon as the extinction of tithes was to take place, and said he was sartin sure 'twas too good news to be true. "Tare Nounty," said another, who was the very antithesis of Daddy in his credulous nature. "Sure, didn't I see it myself in print?" "I was told often that things was in print," returned Daddy dryly, "that come out lies after, to my own knowledge." "But sure," added a third, "sure, didn't the Premier himself lay it all out before the Parliament?" "What Premier are you talking about, man dear?" said Daddy rather testily. "Why, the Premier of His Majesty, no less. Is that satisfaction for you, eh?" "Well, and who is the Premier?" "Why, the Premier of His Majesty, I told you before. You see, he is the one that hears of everything that is to be done for the whole empire in particular. And Becasey, he hears of everything. That's the reason he is called the Prime Ear, and a good reason it is." "Well, but what has that to do with the tithes, I ask you again?" said Daddy with his usual pertinacity. Here he was about to be answered by the former speaker, whose definition of the Premier had won him golden opinions amongst the bystanders, when he was prevented by a fourth orator, who rushed into the debate with this very elegant opening. "Arrah, tare an ounce, yez are setting me mad, so yez are." "Why, I wonder anyone I'd be sich a fool as to go argue-fy with that crooked old disciple there." "Meaning me," said Daddy. "I'd be sorry to contradict you, sir," said the other with an admirable mockery of politeness. "Thank you, sir," said Daddy with a dignity more comical than the other's buffoonery. "You're kindly welcome, Daddy," returned the aggressor. "Sure, you never believed anything yet, and I wonder anyone would throw away their time thriving to rightify you." "Come, boys," said O'Hara, interrupting the discourse, with a view to prevent further bickering. "There's no use talking about the thing now, for whatever way it is, sure we are met to bury the tithe." and it's proud I am to see you all here to make merry upon the strength of it. And I think I heard Honour say this minute that everything is ready in the barn without, so you'll have no difference of opinion about tackling to the breakfast, or I'm mistaken. Come, my hearties, the mate and the precious is crying, who'll ate me? Away with you, that's your sort. And he enforced his summons to the feast by pushing his guests before him towards the scene of action. This was an ample barn, where tables of all sorts and sizes were spread, loaded with viands of the most substantial character, wooden forms, three-legged stools, broken-backed chairs, etc., etc., were in requisition for the accommodation of the female portion of the company, and the men attended first to their wants with a politeness which, though deficient in the external graces of polished life, did credit to their natures. The eating part of the business was accompanied with all the clatter that might be expected to attend such an affair, and when the eatables had been tolerably well demolished, O'Hara stood up in the midst of his guests and said he should propose to them a toast which he knew all the boys would fill their glasses for, and that was to drink the health of the king, and long life to him, for seeing into the rights of the thing and doing such a power for them, and more power to his elbow. This toast was prefaced by a speech to his friends and neighbours upon the hardships of tithe in particular, spiced with the last a taste in life of politics in general, wherein the repeal of the Union and Daniel O'Connell cut no inconsiderable figure, yet in the midst of the rambling address certain glimpses of good sense and shrewd observation might be caught, and the many and powerful objections he advanced against the impost that was to be extinct so soon were put forward with a force and distinctness that were worthy of a better speaker, and might have been found difficult to reply to by a more accustomed hand. He protested that he thought he had lived long enough when he had witnessed in his own lifetime two such national benefits as the Catholic Emancipation Bill and the abolition of tithes. O'Hara further declared he was the happiest man alive that day only in the regard of one thing, and that was that his reverence, Father Healy the priest, was not there amongst them, and certainly the absence of the pastor on an occasion of festivity in the house of a snug farmer is of rare occurrence in Ireland. But you see, said O'Hara, when his reverence heard what it was we were going to do, he thought it would be pertier on his part for to have nothing whatsoever to do with it in hand, act, or part. And indeed, boys, that shews a great deal of good breeding in Father Healy. This was quite agreed to by the company, and, after many cheers for O'Hara's speech, and some other toasts pertinent to the occasion, the health of O'Hara as founder of the feast, with the usual addenda of long life, prosperity, etc., to him and his, was drunk, and then preparations were entered into for proceeding with the ceremony of the funeral. "I believe we have nothing to wait for now," said O'Hara, "since you won't have any more to drink, boys, so let us set about it at once and make a clean day's work of it." "Oh, we're not quite ready yet," said Larry Lanigan, who seemed to be a sort of master of the ceremonies on the occasion. "What's the delay?" asked O'Hara. "Why, the chief mourners is not arrived yet." "What mourners are you talking about, man?" said the other. "Why, you know, at a grand berrin they have always thief mourners, and there's a pair that I ordered to be brought here for that same." "Myself doesn't know anything about mourners," said O'Hara, "for I never seen anything finer than the keeners at a berrin, but Larry's up to the ways of the quality, as well as of his own sort. But you wouldn't have keeners for the tithe, would you?" "Sure, the keeners is to say all the good they can of the departed, and more if they can invent it, but, sure the divil, a good thing at all they could say of the tithe, barren it was lies they were telling, and so it would only be throwing away trouble. Through for you, Lanigan. Besides, it is like a grand baron belonging to the quality to have chief mourners, and you know the tithe was equal to a lord or a king, most for power. In a short time the mourners, as Larry called them, arrived in custody of half a dozen of Larry's chosen companions, to whom he had entrusted the execution of the mission. These chief mourners were 2 tithe proctors, who had been taken forcibly from their homes by the Lanigan party, and threatened with death unless they attended the summons of Larry to be present at the Berrin. Their presence was hailed with a great shout, and the poor devils looked excessively frightened, but they were assured by O'Hara they had nothing to fear. "I depend on you, Mr. O'Hara, for seeing us safe out of their hands," said one of them, for the other was dumb from terror. "So you may," was the answer. O'Hara returned. "Hurt nor harm shall not be put on you, I give you my word of that." "Divil a harm," said Larry. "We'll only put you into a shuto, clothes that is ready for you, and you may look as melancholy as you please, for it is mourners you are to be." "Well, Honor," said he, addressing O'Hara's daughter, "have you got the mithras and vestments ready, as I told you?" "Yes," said Honor. "Here comes Biddy Mulligan with them from the house, for Biddy herself helped me to make them." "And who had a better right?" said Larry, when it was herself that laid it all out complete, the whole thing from the beginning. And sure enough, but it was a bright thought of her. "Thanks, he'll be the lucky man that gets Biddy yet." "You had better have her yourself, I think," said Honor, with an arch look at Larry, full of meaning. "And it's that same I've been thinking of for some time," said Larry, laughing, and returning Honor's look with one that repaid it with interest. "But where is she at all? Oh, here she comes with the duds, and Mike Noonan after her, Throth. He's following her about all this morning, like a sucking calf. I'm afeard Mikey is going to circumvent me with Biddy, but he'd better mind what he's at." Here the conversation was interrupted by the advance of Biddy Mulligan, and Mickey Noonan after her, bearing some grotesque imitation of clerical vestments made of coarse sacking, and 2 enormous headdresses made of straw in the fashion of mitres. These were decorated with black rags hung fantastically above them, while the vestments were smeared over with black stripes in no very regular order. "Come here," said Larry to the tithe proctors. "Come here, until we put you into your regimentals." "What are you going to do with us, Mr. Lanigan?" said the frightened poor wretch, while his knees knocked together with terror. "We are just going to make a pair o' bishops of you," said Lanigan, "and sure that's promotion for you." "Oh, Mr. O'Hara," said the proctor, "sure you won't let them tie us up in them sacks? Do you hear what he calls the elegant vestments we made a purpose for him? They are sackcloth, to be sure, and why not, seeing as how that you are to be the chief mourners? And sackcloth and ashes is what you must be dressed in, according to Rayson. Here, my buck," said the rollicking Larry, "I'll be your valet de sham myself." And he proceeded to put the dress on the terrified tithe proctor. "Oh, Mr. Lanigan, dear," said he, "don't murther me, if you please." "Murther you? Arrah, who's going to murther you? Do you think I'd dirty my hands with killing a snake in tithe proctor? Indeed, that's true, Mr. Lanigan. It would not be worth your while." "Here now," said Larry, "hold your head till I put the mithry on you and make you a bishop complete. But wait a bit, Throth. I was nigh forgetting the ashes, and that would have been a great loss to both of you, Beccassay. You wouldn't be right, mourners at all, without them, and the people would think you were only pretending." This last bit of Larry's waggery produced great merriment amongst the bystanders, for the unfortunate tithe proctors were looking at that moment most doleful examples of wretchedness. A large shovelful of turf ashes was now shaken over their heads, and then they were decorated with their mitres. "Tut, man," said Larry to one of them, "don't thrimble like a dog in a wet sack." "Oh, thin. Look at him, how pale he's turned, the dirty coward that he is. I tell you, we're not going to do you any hurt, so you needn't be looking in sich mortal dread. By gore, you're as white as Pennorth curds in a sweep's fist." With many such jokes at the expense of the tithe proctors, they were attired in their caricature robes and mitres, and presented with a pair of pitchforks by way of croziers, and were recommended at the same time to make hay while the sun shone. Beccasse, the fine weather would be laving them soon, with many other bitter sarcasms, conveyed in the language of ridicule. The procession was now soon arranged, and, as they had their chief mourners, it was thought a good point of contrast to have their chief rejoicers as well. To this end, in a large cart, they put a sow and her litter of pigs, decorated with ribands, a sheaf of wheat standing proudly erect, a bowl of large potatoes which, at Honor O'Hara's suggestion, were boiled, that they might be laughing on the occasion, and over these was hung a rude banner, on which was written, "We may stay at home now." In this cart, Hoppy Hooligan, the fiddler, with a piper as a coadjutor, rasped and squeaked their best to the tune of "Go to the devil and shake yourself," which was meant to convey a delicate hint to the tithes for the future. The whole assemblage of people, and it was immense, then proceeded to the spot where it was decided. The tithe was to be interred as the most fitting place to receive such a deposit, and this place was called by what they considered the very appropriate name of the Devil's Bit. In a range of hills, in the neighbourhood where this singular occurrence took place, there is a sudden gap occurs in the outline of the ridge, which is stated to have been formed by His Sable Majesty taking a bite out of the mountain. Whether it was spite or hunger that had made him do so is not ascertained, but he evidently did not consider it a very savoury morsel, for it is said he spat it out again, and the rejected morceau forms the rock of Cashel. Such is the wild legend of this wild spot, and here was the interment of the tithe to be achieved, as an appropriate addition to the Devil's Bit. The procession now moved onward, and, as it proceeded, its numbers were considerably augmented. Its approach was looked for by a scout on every successive hill it came within sight of, and a wild halloo, or the winding of a cow's horn, immediately succeeded, which called forth scores of fresh attendants upon the Baron. Thus their numbers were increased. Every quarter of a mile they went, until, on their arriving at the foot of the hill which they were to ascend to reach their final destination, the multitude assembled presented a most imposing appearance. In the course of their march, the great point of attraction for the young men and women was the cart that bore the piper and fiddler, and the road was rather danced than walked over in this quarter. The other distinguished portion of the train was where the two tithe proctors played their parts of chief mourners. They were the delight of all the little ragged urchins in the country. The half-naked young vagabonds hung on their flanks, plucked at their vestments, made wry faces at them, called them by many ridiculous names, and an occasional lump of clay was slily flung at their mitres, which were too tempting a cockshot to be resisted. The multitude now wound up the hill, and the mingling of laughter, of singing and shouting, produced a wild compound of sound that rang far and wide. As they doubled an angle in the road, which opened the Devil's Bit full upon their view, they saw another crowd assembled there, which consisted of persons from the other side of the hills, who could not be present at the breakfast, nor join the procession, but who attended upon the spot where the interment was to take place. As soon as the approach of the funeral train was perceived from the top of the hill, the mass of people there sent forth a shout of welcome, which was returned by those from below. Short space now served to bring both parties together, and the digging of a grave did not take long with such a plenty of able hands for the purpose. "Come, boys," said Larry Lanigan to 2 or 3 of his companions. "While they are digging the grave here, we'll go cut some sods to put over it when the thieving tithe is buried, not for any respect I have for it in particular, but that we may have the place smooth and clean to dance over afterwards, and may I never shuffle the brogue again. If myself and Honor O'Hara won't be the first pair that'll set you a pattern." All was soon ready for the interment. The tithe coffin was lowered into the pit, and the shouting that rent the air was terrific. As they were about to fill up the grave with earth, their wild hurrah, that had rung out so loudly, was answered by a fierce shout at some distance, and all eyes were turned towards the quarter whence it arose to see from whom it proceeded, for it was evidently a solitary voice that had thus arrested their attention. Toiling up the hill, supporting himself with a staff, and bearing a heavy load in a wallet slung over his shoulders, appeared an elderly man whose dress proclaimed him at once to be a person who depended on eleemosynary contributions for his subsistence, and many, when they caught the first glimpse of him, proclaimed at once that it was Tather the Road was coming. Tather the Road? Way! The very descriptive name that had been applied to this poor creature, for he was always travelling about the highways. He never rested even at nights in any of the houses of the peasants who would have afforded him shelter, but seemed to be possessed by a restless spirit that urged him to constant motion. Of course the poor creature sometimes slept, but it must have been under such shelter as a hedge or cave or gravel pit might afford, for in the habitation of man he was never seen to sleep, and, indeed, I never knew anyone who had seen this strange being in the act of sleep. This fact attached a sort of mysterious character to the wanderer, and many would tell you that he wasn't right, and firmly believed that he never slept at all. His mind was unsettled, and though he never became offensive in any degree from his mental aberration, yet the nature of his distemper often induced him to do very extraordinary things, and whenever the gift of speech was upon him, for he was habitually taciturn, he would make an outpouring of some rhapsody, in which occasional bursts of very powerful language and striking imagery would occur. Indeed, the peasants said that sometimes would make hair stand on end to hear Tather the Road make an oration. This poor man's history, as far as I could learn, was a very melancholy one. In the rebellion of his cabin had been burned over his head by the yeomanry, after every violation that could disgrace his hearth had been committed. He and his son, then little more than a boy, had attempted to defend their hut, and they were both left for dead. His wife and his daughter, a girl of 16, were also murdered. The wretched father unfortunately recovered his life, but his reason was gone forever. Even in the midst of his poverty and madness, there was a sort of respect attached to this singular man. Though depending on charity for his meat and drink, he could not well be called a beggar, for he never asked for anything even on the road, when some passenger, ignorant of his wild history, saw the poor wanderer. A piece of money was often bestowed to the silent appeal of his rags, his haggard features, and his grisly hair and beard. Thus eternally up and down the country was he, moving about, and hence his name of Tather the Road. It was not long until the old man gained the summit of the hill, but while he was approaching, many were the wonders. What in the name of fortune could have brought Tather the Road there? "And by dad," said one, "he's pulling foot at a great rate. And it's wonderful how an old cock like him can clamber up the hill so fast." "Aye," said another, "and with the weight he's carrying too." "Sure enough," said a third. "Faix, he's got a fine lob in his wallet today." "Whisht," said O'Hara, "here he comes, and his ears are as sharp as needles." "And his eyes too," said a woman. Lord be good to me. Did you ever see poor Tatha's eyes look so terrible? Bright afore. And indeed, this remark was not uncalled for the eyes of the old man almost gleamed from under the shaggy brows that were darkly bent over them, as, with long strides, he approached the crowd which opened before him. And he stalked up to the side of the grave and threw down the ponderous wallet, which fell to the ground with a heavy crash. "You were going to close the grave too soon," were the first words he uttered. "Sure! When the tithe is once buried, what more have we to do?" said one of the bystanders. "Aye, you have put the tithe in the grave, but will it stay there?" "Why, indeed," said Larry Lanigan. "I think he'd be a bold resurrection man that would come to rise it. I have brought you something here to lie heavy on it, and 'twill never rise more," said the maniac, striking forth his arm fiercely and clenching his hand firmly. "And what have you brought us, Agra?" said O'Hara kindly to him. "Look here," said the other, unfolding his wallet and displaying 5 or 6 large stones. Some were tempted to laugh, but a mysterious dread of the wild being before them prevented any outbreak of mirth. "God help the crathur," said a woman, so loud as to be heard. "He has brought a bag full of stones to throw atop a dobber. The tithes to keep them down, or wisha, poor crathur, eye stones," said the maniac. "But do you know what stones these are? Look, woman," and his manner became intensely impressive from the excitement even of madness under which he was acting. "Look, I say there's not a stone there that's not a curse. Aye, a curse so heavy that nothing can ever rise that falls under it." "Oh, I don't want to say against it, dear," said the woman. The maniac did not seem to notice her submissive answer, but pursuing his train of madness, continued his address in his native tongue, whose figurative and poetical construction was heightened in its effect by a manner and action almost theatrically descriptive. "You all remember the widow Dempsey. The first choice of her bosom was long gone, but the son she loved was left to her, and her heart was not quite lonely. And at the widow's hearth there was still a welcome for the stranger, and the son of her heart made his choice, like the father before him, and the joy of the widow's house was increased, for the son of her heart was happy. And in due time the widow welcomed the fair-haired child of her son to the world, and a dream of her youth came over her, as she saw the joy of her son and her daughter when they kissed the fair-haired child. But the hand of God was heavy in the land, and the fever fell hard upon the poor, and the widow was again bereft, for the son of her heart was taken, and the wife of his bosom also, and the fair-haired child was left an orphan. And the widow would have laid down her bones and died, but for the fair-haired child that had none to look to but her. And the widow blessed God's name and bent her head to the blow, and the orphan that was left to her was the pulse of her heart. And often she looked on his pale face with a fearful eye, for health was not on the cheek of the boy, but she cherished him tenderly. But the ways of the world grew crooked to the lone woman when the son, that was the staff of her age, was gone, and one trouble followed another. But still the widow was not quite destitute. And what was it brought? The heavy stroke of distress and disgrace to the widow's door? The tithe! The widow's cow was driven and sold to pay a few shillings. The drop of milk was no longer in the widow's house, and the tender child that needed the nourishment wasted away before the widow's eyes like snow from the ditch, and died, and fast the widow followed the son of her heart and his fair-haired boy. And now the home of an honest race is a heap of rubbish, and the bleak wind whistles over the hearth where the warm welcome was ever found, and the cold frog crouches under the ruins. These stones are from that desolate place, and the curse of God that follows oppression is on them. and let them be cast into the grave, and they will lie with the weight of a mountain on the monster that is buried forever." So saying, he lifted stone after stone and flung them fiercely into the pits. Then, after a moment's pause upon its verge, he suddenly strode away with the same noiseless step that he had approached, and left the scene in silence. The capien was an ancient headdress of gorgeous material, and the name is applied in derision to a shabby hat. The crop being often valued in a green state in Ireland, the appraiser becomes a very obnoxious person. Botany Bay, the stump of pipe. Accepting. Keeners are persons who sing the ulican, or death wail, round the coffin of the deceased, and repeat the good deeds of the departed. I think Ware mentions an ancient crown being dug up at the devil's bit. Pull foot is a figurative expression to express making haste. The Knightsbridge Mystery. In Charles II's day, the Swan was denounced by the dramatists as a house where unfaithful wives and mistresses met their gallants. But in the next century, when John Clarke was the freeholder, no special imputation of that sort rested on it. It was a country inn, with large stables, horsed the Brentford coach, and entertained man and beast on journeys long or short. It had also permanent visitors, especially in summer, for it was near London, and yet a rural retreat, meadows on each side, Hyde Park at back, Knightsbridge, green in front. Amongst the permanent lodgers was Mr. Gardiner, a substantial man, and Captain Cowan, a retired officer of moderate means, had lately taken 2 rooms for himself and his son. Mr. Gardiner often joined the company in the public room, but the Cowans kept to themselves upstairs. This was soon noticed and resented in that age of few books and free converse. Some said, "Oh, we are not good enough for him." Others inquired what a half-pay captain had to give himself airs about. Candour interposed and supplied the climax. "Nay, my masters, the captain may be in hiding from duns, or from the runners. Now I think on't, the York mail was robbed, scarce a seen night before his worship came, a hiding here." But the landlady's tongue ran the other way. Her weight was 16 stone, her sentiments were her interests, and her tongue her tomahawk. "'Tis pity," said she one day, "some folk can't keep their tongues from blackening of their betters. The captain is a civil-spoken gentleman. Lord send there were more of them in these parts, as takes his hat off to me whenever he meets me, and pays his reckoning weekly. If he has a mind to be private, what business is that of yours or ours? But curs must bark at their betters. Detraction, thus roughly quelled for certain seconds, revived at intervals whenever Dame Gust's broad back was turned. It was mildly encountered one evening by Gardiner. "Nay, good sirs," said he, "you mistake the worthy captain. To have fought at Blenheim and Malplaquet, no man has less vanity. 'Tis for his son he holds aloof. He guards the youth like a mother, and will not have him to hear our tap-room jests. He worships the boy. A sullen lout, sirs, but paternal love is blind. He told me once he had loved his wife dearly, and lost her young, and this was all he had of her. And, said he, I'd spill blood like water for him, my own the first. Then, sir, says I fear he will give you a sore heart one day. And welcome, says my captain, and his face like iron. Somebody remarked that no man keeps out of company who is good company, but Mr. Gardiner parried that dogma. When young master is abed, my neighbour does sometimes invite me to share a bottle, and a sprightlier companion I would not desire. Such stories of battles and duels and love intrigues. Now there's an old fox for you, said one approvingly. It reconciled him to the captain's decency to find that it was only hypocrisy. I like not a man who wears a mask, hiccoughed a hitherto silent personage. revealing his clandestine drunkenness and unsuspected wisdom at one blow. These various theories were still fermenting in the bosom of the Swan, when one day there rode up to the door a gorgeous officer, hot from the minister's levee, in scarlet and gold, with an order like a starfish glittering on his breast. His servant, a private soldier, rode behind him, and, slipping hastily from his saddle, held his master's horse while he dismounted. Just then Captain Cowan came out for his afternoon walk. He started and cried out, "Colonel Barrington!" "Aye, brother," cried the other, and instantly the two officers embraced and even kissed each other, for that feminine custom had not yet retired across the Channel. And these were soldiers who had fought and bled side by side and nursed each other in turn. And your true soldier does not nurse by halves. His vigilance and tenderness are an example to women, and he rustleth not. Captain Cowan invited Colonel Barrington to his room, and that warrior marched down the passage after him, single file, with long brass spurs and sabre clinking at his heels. And the establishment ducked and smiled, and respected Captain Cowan for the reason we admire the moon. Seated in Cowan's room, the newcomer said heartily, "Well, Ned, I come not empty-handed. Here is thy pension at last," and handed him a parchment with a seal like a poached egg. Cowan changed colour, and thanked him with an emotion he rarely betrayed, and gloated over the precious document. His cast-iron features relaxed, and he said, "It comes in the nick of time, for now I can send my dear Jack to college." This led somehow to an exposure of his affairs. He had just a year derived from the sale of his commission, which he had invested at 15%, with a well-known mercantile house in the city. "So now," said he, "I shall divide it all in 3. Jack will want 2 parts to live at Oxford, and I can do well enough here on 1. The rest of the conversation does not matter, so I dismiss it, and Colonel Barrington for the time. A few days afterward, Jack went to college, and Captain Cowan reduced his expenses and dined at the shilling ordinary, and, indeed, took all his moderate repasts in public. Instead of the severe and reserved character he had worn while his son was with him, he now shone out a boon companion, and sometimes kept the table in a roar with his marvellous mimicries of all the characters, male or female, that lived in the inn or frequented it, and sometimes held them breathless with adventures, dangers, intrigues, in which a leading part had been played by himself or his friends. He became quite a popular character. Except with 1 or 2 envious bodies, whom he eclipsed, they revenged themselves by saying it was all braggadocio. His battles had been fought over a bottle, and by the fireside. The district east and west of Knightsbridge had long been infested with footpads. They robbed passengers in the country lanes which then abounded, and sometimes on the King's Highway, from which those lanes offered an easy escape. One moonlight night, Captain Cowan was returning home alone from an entertainment at Fulham, when suddenly the air seemed to fill with a woman's screams and cries. They issued from a lane on his right hand. He whipped out his sword and dashed down the lane. It took a sudden turn, and in a moment he came upon 3 footpads robbing and maltreating an old gentleman and his wife. The old man's sword lay at a distance. Struck from his feeble hand, the woman's tongue proved the better weapon, for at least it brought an ally. The nearest robber, seeing the captain come at him with his drawn sword glittering in the moonshine, fired hastily and grazed his cheek, and was skewered like a frog the next moment. His cry of agony mingled with 2 shouts of dismay, and the other footpads fled, but, even as they turned, Captain Cowan's nimble blade entered the shoulder of one, and pierced the fleshy part. He escaped, however, but howling and bleeding. Captain Cowan handed over the lady and gentleman to the people who flocked to the place. Now the work was done. and the disabled robber to the guardians of the public peace, who arrived last of all. He himself withdrew apart and wiped his sword very carefully and minutely with a white pocket handkerchief, and then retired. He was so far from parading his exploit that he went round by the park and let himself into the Swan with his private key, and was going quietly to bed when the chambermaid met him, and up flew her arms with cries of dismay. "Oh, Captain, Captain, look at you smothered in blood!" "I shall faint." "Tush, silly wench," said Captain Cowan. "I am not hurt." "Not hurt, sir, and bleeding like a pig. Your cheek, your poor cheek." Captain Cowan put up his hand and found that blood was really welling from his cheek and ear. He looked grave for a moment, then assured her it was but a scratch, and offered to convince her of that. "Bring me some lukewarm water, and thou shalt be my doctor." "But, Barbara, prithee, publish it not." Next morning, an officer of justice inquired after him at the Swan, and demanded his attendance at Bow Street at 2 that afternoon to give evidence against the footpads. This was the very thing he wished to avoid, but there was no evading the summons. The officer was invited into the bar by the landlady, and sang the gallant captain's exploit, with his own variations. The inn began to ring with Cowan's praises. Indeed, there was now but one detractor left, the hostler, Daniel Cox, a drunken fellow of sinister aspect, who had for some time stared and lowered at Captain Cowan, and muttered mysterious things, doubts as to his being a real captain, etc., which incoherent murmurs of a muddle-headed drunkard were not treated as oracular by any human creature, though the stable-boy once went so far as to say, "I sometimes almost thinks as how our Dan do know summat, only he don't rightly know what 'tis, along o' being always muddled in liquor." Cowan, who seemed to notice little, but noticed everything, had observed the lowering looks of this fellow, and felt he had an enemy. It even made him a little uneasy, though he was too proud and self-possessed to show it. With this exception, then, everybody greeted him with hearty compliments, and he was cheered out of the inn, marching to Bow Street. Daniel Cox, who, as accidents will happen, was sober that morning, saw him out, and then put on his own coat. "Take thou charge of the stable, Sam," said he. "Why, where be'st going at this time o' day?" "I be going to Bow Street," said Daniel doggedly. At Bow Street, Captain Cowan was received with great respect, and a seat given him by the sitting magistrate, while some minor cases were disposed of. In due course, the highway robbery was called and proved by the parties who, unluckily for the accused, had been actually robbed before Cowan interfered. Then the oath was tendered to Cowan. He stood up by the magistrate's side and deposed, with military brevity and exactness, to the facts I have related, but refused to swear to the identity of the individual culprit, who stood pale and trembling at the dock. The attorney for the Crown, after pressing in vain, said, "Quite right, Captain Cowan, a witness cannot be too scrupulous." He then called an officer who had found the robber leaning against a railing, fainting from loss of blood, scarce a furlong from the scene of the robbery, and wounded in the shoulder. That let in Captain Cowan's evidence, and the culprit was committed for trial, and soon after peached upon his only comrade at large. The other lay in the hospital at Newgate. The magistrate complimented Captain Cowan on his conduct and his evidence, and he went away universally admired. Yet he was not elated, nor indeed content. Sitting by the magistrate's side, after he had given his evidence, he happened to look all round the court, and in a distant corner he saw the enormous mottled nose and sinister eyes of Daniel Cox glaring at him with a strange but puzzled expression. Cowan had learned to read faces, and he said to himself, "What is there in that ruffian's mind about me? Did he know me years ago? I cannot remember him. Curse the beast. One would almost think he is cudgelling his drunken memory. I'll keep an eye on you." He went home thoughtful and discomposed, because this drunkard glowered at him so. The reception he met with at the Swan effaced the impression. He was received with acclamations, and now that publicity was forced on him, he accepted it and revelled in popularity. About this time he received a letter from his son, enclosing a notice from the college tutor, speaking highly of his ability, good conduct, devotion to study. This made the father swell with loving pride. Jack hinted modestly that there were unavoidable expenses and his funds were dwindling. He enclosed an account that showed how the money went. The father wrote back and bade him be easy. He should have every farthing required, and speedily. "For," said he, "my half-year's interest is due now." 2 days after he had a letter from his man of business begging him to call. He went with alacrity, making sure his money was waiting for him as usual. His lawyer received him very gravely and begged him to be seated. He then broke to him some appalling news. The great house of Brown, Molyneux and Co. had suspended payments at noon the day before, and were not expected to pay a shilling in the pound. Captain Cowen's little fortune was gone, all but his pension of £80 a year. He sat like a man turned to stone. Then he clasped his hands with agony, and uttered 2 words, no more. "My son!" He rose and left the place like one in a dream. He got down to Knightsbridge, he hardly knew how. At the very door of the inn he fell down in a fit. The people of the inn were round him in a moment, and restoratives freely supplied. His sturdy nature soon revived, but, with the moral and physical shock, his lips were slightly distorted over his clenched teeth. His face, too, was ashy pale. When he came to himself, the first face he noticed was that of Daniel Cox, eyeing him, not with pity, but with puzzled curiosity. Cowen shuddered, and closed his own eyes to avoid this blighting glare. Then, without opening them, he muttered, "What has befallen me? I feel no wound." "Laws forbid, sir," said the landlady, leaning over him. "Your honour did but swoon for once, to show you was born of a woman, and not made of naught but steel. Here, you gaping loons and sluts, help the captain to his room amongst ye, and then go about your business." This order was promptly executed so far as assisting Captain Cowen to rise, but he was no sooner on his feet than he waved them all from him haughtily and said, "Let me be. It is the mind. It is the mind." And he smote his forehead in despair, for now it all came back on him. Then he rushed into the inn and locked himself into his room. Female curiosity buzzed about the doors, but was not admitted until he had recovered his fortitude and formed a bitter resolution to defend himself and his son against all mankind. At last there came a timid tap, and a mellow voice said, "It is only me, Captain. Prithee, let me in." He opened to her, and there was Barbara with a large tray and a snow-white cloth. She spread a table deftly, and uncovered a roast capon, and uncorked a bottle of white port, talking all the time. "The mistress says you must eat a bit, and drink this good wine for her sake. Indeed, sir, 'twill do you good after your swoon." With many such encouraging words, she got him to sit down and eat, and then filled his glass and put it to his lips. He could not eat much, but he drank the white port, a wine much prized, and purer than the purple vintage of our day. At last came Barbara's post-diet. "But alack! To think of your fainting dead away! Oh, Captain, what is the trouble?" The tear was in Barbara's eye, though she was the emissary of Dame Cust's curiosity, and all curiosity herself. Captain Cowen, who had been expecting this question for some time, replied doggedly, "I have lost the best friend I had in the world." "Dear heart," said Barbara, and a big tear of sympathy that had been gathering ever since she entered the room rolled down her cheeks. She put up a corner of her apron to her eyes. "Alas, poor soul," said she. I do know how hard it is to love and lose, but bethink you, sir, 'tis the lot of man, our own turn must come, and you have your son left to thank God for, and a warm friend or two in this place, though they be but humble." "Ay, good wench," said the soldier, his iron nature touched for a moment by her goodness and simplicity, "and none I value more than thee. But leave me a while." The young woman's honest cheeks reddened at the praise of such a man. "Your will's my pleasure, sir," said she, and retired, leaving the capon and the wine. Any little compunction he might have at refusing his confidence to this humble friend did not trouble him long. He looked on women as leaky vessels, and he had firmly resolved not to make his situation worse by telling the base world that he was poor. Many a hard rub had put a fine point on this man of steel. He glozed the matter, too, in his own mind. "I told her no lie. I have lost my best friend, for I've lost my money." From that day, Captain Cowan visited the tap-room no more, and indeed seldom went out by daylight. He was all alone now, for Mr. Gardner was gone to Wiltshire to collect his rents. In his solitary chamber, Cowan ruminated his loss and the villainy of mankind, and his busy brain revolved scheme after scheme to repair the impending ruin of his son's prospects. It was there the iron entered his soul. The example of the very footpads he had baffled occurred to him in his more desperate moments, but he fought the temptation down, and in due course one of them was transported, and one hung, the other languished in Newgate. By and by he began to be mysteriously busy, and the door always locked. No clue was ever found to his labours but bits of melted wax in the fender and a tuft or two of grey hair, and it was never discovered in Knightsbridge that he often begged in the city at dusk, in a disguise so perfect that a frequenter of the Swan once gave him a groat. Thus did he levy his tax upon the stony place that had undone him. Instead of taking his afternoon walk as heretofore, he would sit disconsolate on the seat of a staircase window that looked into the yard, and so take the air and sun, and it was owing to this new habit he overheard, one day, a dialogue in which the foggy voice of the hostler predominated at first. He was running down Captain Cowan to a potboy. The potboy stood up for him. That annoyed Cox. He spoke louder and louder the more he was opposed, till at last he bawled out, "I tell ye, I've seen him a-sitting by the judge, and I've seen him in the dock." At these words, Captain Cowan recoiled, though he was already out of sight, and his eye glittered like a basilisk's. But immediately a new voice broke upon the scene, a woman's. "Thou foul-mouthed knave! Is it for thee to slander men of worship and give the inn a bad name? Remember, I have but to lift my finger to hang thee, so drive me not tote. Begone to thy horses this moment, thou art not fit to be among Christians. Begone, I say, or it shall be the worse for thee." And she drove him across the yard, and followed him up with a current of invectives, eloquent even at a distance, though the words were no longer distinct. And who should this be but the housemaid, Barbara Lamb, so gentle, mellow, and melodious before the gentlefolk, and especially her hero, Captain Cowan. As for Daniel Cox, he cowered, writhed, and wriggled away before her, and slipped into the stable. Captain Cowan was now soured by trouble, and this persistent enmity of that fellow roused at last a fixed and deadly hatred in his mind, all the more intense that fear mingled with it. He sounded Barbara, asked her what nonsense that ruffian had been talking, and what he had done that she could hang him for. But Barbara would not say a malicious word against a fellow servant in cold blood. "I can keep a secret," said she. If he keeps his tongue off you, I'll keep mine." "So be it," said Cowan. "Then I warn you, I am sick of his insolence, and drunkards must be taught not to make enemies of sober men, nor fools of wise men." He said this so bitterly that, to soothe him, she begged him not to trouble about the ravings of a sot. "Dear heart," said she, "nobody heeds Dan Cox." Some days afterward she told him that Dan had been drinking harder than ever, and wouldn't trouble honest folk long, for he had the delusions that go before a drunkard's end. Why, he had told the stable boy he had seen a vision of himself climb over the garden wall and enter the house by the back door. The poor wretch says he knew himself by his bottle-nose and his cowskin waistcoat. And, to be sure, there is no such nose in the parish, thank heaven for't. And not many such waistcoats. She laughed heartily, but Cowan's lip curled in a venomous sneer. He said, "More likely 'twas the knave himself. Look to your spoons, if such a face as that walks by night." Barbara turned grave directly. He eyed her askant, and saw the random shot had gone home. Captain Cowan now often slept in the city, alleging business. Mr. Gardiner wrote from Salisbury, ordering his room to be ready, and his sheets well aired. One afternoon he returned with a bag and a small valise, prodigiously heavy. He had a fire lighted, though it was fine autumn, for he was chilled with his journey, and invited Captain Cowan to sup with him. The latter consented, but begged it might be an early supper, as he must sleep in the city. "I am sorry for that," said Gardiner. "I have 180 guineas there in that bag, and a man could get into my room from yours." "Not if you lock the middle door," said Cowan, "but I can leave you the key of my outer door for that matter." This offer was accepted, but still Mr. Gardiner felt uneasy. There had been several robberies at inns, and it was a rainy, gusty night. He was depressed and ill at ease. Then Captain Cowan offered him his pistols and helped him load them 2 bullets in each. He also went and fetched him a bottle of the best port, and after drinking 1 glass with him, hurried away and left his key with him for further security. Mr. Gardiner, left to himself, made up a great fire and took a glass or 2 of the wine. It seemed remarkably heady, and raised his spirits. After all, it was only for 1 night. Tomorrow he would deposit his gold in the bank. He began to unpack his things and put his nightdress to the fire, but by and by he felt so drowsy that he did but take his coat off, put his pistols under the pillow, and lay down on the bed and fell fast asleep. That night Barbara Lamb awoke twice, thinking each time she heard doors open and shut on the floor below her. But it was a gusty night, and she concluded it was most likely the wind. Still, a residue of uneasiness made her rise at 5 instead of 6, and she lighted her tinder and came down with a rushlight. She found Captain Cowan's door wide open. It had been locked when she went to bed. That alarmed her greatly. She looked in. A glance was enough. She cried, "Thieves! Thieves!" and in a moment uttered scream upon scream. In an incredibly short time, pale and eager faces of men and women filled the passage. Cowan's room, being open, was entered first. On the floor lay what Barbara had seen at a glance, his portmanteau rifled and the clothes scattered about. The door of communication was ajar. They opened it, and an appalling sight met their eyes. Mr. Gardiner was lying in a pool of blood and moaning feebly. There was little hope of saving him. No human body could long survive such a loss of the vital fluid. But it so happened there was a country surgeon in the house. He staunched the wounds. There were 3, and somebody or other had the sense to beg the victim to make a statement. He was unable at first, but, under powerful stimulants, revived at last, and showed a strong wish to aid justice in avenging him. By this time they had got a magistrate to attend, and he put his ear to the dying man's lips, but others heard, So hushed was the room, and so keen the awe and curiosity of each panting heart. I had gold in my portmanteau, and was afraid. I drank a bottle of wine with Captain Cowan, and he left me. He lent me his key and his pistols. I locked both doors. I felt very sleepy, and lay down. When I woke, a man was leaning over my portmanteau. His back was toward me. I took a pistol and aimed steadily. It missed fire. The man turned and sprang on me. I had caught up a knife, one we had for supper. I stabbed him with all my force. He wrested it from me, and I felt piercing blows. I am slain. I am slain. But the man, sir, did you not see his face at all? Not till he fell on me, but then, very plainly, the moon shone. Pray describe him. Broken hat. Yes. Hairy waistcoat. Yes. Enormous nose. Do you know him? I. The hostler, Cox. There was a groan of horror and a cry for vengeance. "Silence!" said the magistrate. "Mr. Gardner, you are a dying man. Words may kill. Be careful. Have you any doubts?" "About what?" "That the villain was Daniel Cox." "None whatever." At these words, the men and women, who were glaring with pale faces and all their senses strained at the dying man and his faint yet terrible denunciation, broke into two bands. Some remained rooted to the place. The rest hurried, with cries of vengeance, in search of Daniel Cox. They were met in the yard by two constables, and rushed first to the stables. Not that they hoped to find him there. Of course he had absconded with his booty. The stable door was ajar. They tore it open. The grey dawn revealed Cox fast asleep on the straw in the first empty stall, and his bottle in the manger. His clothes were bloody, and the man was drunk. They pulled him, cursed him, struck him, and would have torn him in pieces, but the constables interfered, set him up against the rail like timber, and searched his bosom, and found a wound, then turned all his pockets inside out, amidst great expectation, and found 3 halfpence and the key of the stable door. Chapter 2. They ransacked the straw, and all the premises, and found nothing. Then, to make him sober and get something out of him, they pumped upon his head till he was very nearly choked. However, it told on him. He gasped for breath a while, and rolled his eyes, and then coolly asked them, had they found the villain? They shook their fists at him. "Aye, we have found the villain, red-handed. I mean him as prowls about these parts in my waistcoat, and drove his knife into me last night. Wonder it didn't kill me out of hand. Have ye found him amongst ye?" This question met with a volley of jeers and execrations, and the constables pinioned him, and bundled him off in a cart to Bow Street to wait examination. Meantime, 2 Bow Street runners came down with a warrant, and made a careful examination of the premises. The 2 keys were on the table. Mr. Gardner's outer door was locked. There was no money either in his portmanteau of Captain Cowan's. Both pistols were found loaded, but no priming in the pan of the one that lay on the bed. The other was primed, but the bullets were above the powder. Bradbury, one of the runners, took particular notice of all. Outside, blood was traced from the stable to the garden wall, and under this wall, in the grass, a bloody knife was found belonging to the Swan Inn. There was 1 knife less in Mr. Smith's Gardiner's room than had been carried up to his supper. Mr. Gardiner lingered till noon, but never spoke again. The news spread swiftly, and Captain Cowan came home in the afternoon, very pale and shocked. He had heard of a robbery and murder at the Swan, and came to know more. The landlady told him all that had transpired, and that the villain Cox was in prison. Cowan listened thoughtfully, and said, "Cox! No doubt he is a knave, but murder! I should never have suspected him of that. The landlady pooh-poohed his doubts. Why, sir, the poor gentleman knew him, and wounded him in self-defence, and the rogue was found a-bleeding from that very wound. And my knife has done the murder, not a stone's throw from him has done it, which it was that Dan Cox and he'll swing fort, please God. Then, changing her tone, she said solemnly, "You'll come and see him, sir?" "Yes," said Cowan resolutely, with scarce a moment's hesitation. The landlady led the way and took the keys out of her pocket and opened Cowan's door. "We keep all locked," said she, half apologetically. "The magistrate bade us, and everything as we found it, God help us. There, look at your portmanteau. I wish you may not have been robbed as well." "No matter," said he. "But it matters to me," said she, "for the credit of the house." Then she gave him the key of the inner door, and waved her hand toward it, and sat down and began to cry. Cowan went in and saw the appalling sight. He returned quickly, looking like a ghost, and muttered, "This is a terrible business." "It is a bad business for me and all," said she. "He have robbed you too. I'll go bail." Captain Cowan examined his trunk carefully. "Nothing to speak of," said he. "I've lost 8 guineas and my gold watch." "There, there, there," cried the landlady. "What does that matter, dame? He has lost his life." "Ay, poor soul. But 'twon't bring him back, you being robbed and all. Was ever such an unfortunate woman? Murder and robbery in my house. Travellers will shun it like a pest-house. And the new landlord, he only wanted a good excuse to take it down altogether." This was followed by more sobbing and crying. Cowan took her downstairs into the bar and comforted her. They had a glass of spirits together, and he encouraged the flow of her egotism, till at last she fully persuaded herself it was her calamity that one man was robbed and another murdered in her house. Cowan, always a favourite, quite won her heart by falling into this view of the matter, and when he told her he must go back to the city again, for he had important business, and besides had no money left, either in his pockets or his rifled valise, she encouraged him to go, and said kindly, indeed it was no place for him now. It was very good of him to come back at all, but both apartments should be scoured and made decent in a very few days, and a new carpet down in Mr. Broom, gardener's room. So Cowan went back to the city and left this notable woman to mop up her murder. At Bow Street next morning, in answer to the evidence of his guilt, Cox told a tale which the magistrate said was even more ridiculous than most of the stories. Uneducated criminals get up on such occasions. With this single comment he committed Cox for trial. Everybody was of the magistrate's opinion, except a single Bow Street runner, the same who had already examined the premises. This man suspected Cox, but had one qualm of doubt founded on the place where he had discovered the knife, and the circumstance of the blood being traced from that place to the stable, and not from the inn to the stable, and on a remark Cox had made to him in the cart. "I don't belong to the house. I ain't got no keys to go in and out o' nights. And if I took a hatful of gold, I'd be off with it into another country. Wouldn't you? Him as took the gentleman's money, he knew where 'twas, and he have got it, I didn't, and I han't." Bradbury came down to the Swan and asked the landlady a question or two. She gave him short answers. He then told her that he wished to examine the wine that had come down from Mr. Gardiner's room. The landlady looked him in the face, and said it had been drunk by the servants or thrown away long ago. "I have my doubts of that," said he. "And welcome," said she. Then he wished to examine the keyholes. "No," said she, "there has been prying enough into my house." Said he angrily, "You are obstructing justice. It is very suspicious." "It is you that is suspicious." "And a mischief-maker into the bargain," said she. "How do I know what you might put into my wine and my keyholes? And say you found it? You are well known, you Bow Street runners, for your hanky-panky tricks. Have you got a search warrant to throw more discredit upon my house? No? Then pack, and learn the law before you teach it me." Bradbury retired, bitterly indignant, and his indignation strengthened his faint doubt of Cox's guilt. He set a friend to watch the Swan, and he himself gave his mind to the whole case, and visited Cox in Newgate 3 times before his trial. The next novelty was that legal assistance was provided for Cox by a person who expressed compassion for his poverty and inability to defend himself, guilty or not guilty. And that benevolent person was Captain Cowan. In due course, Daniel Cox was arraigned at the bar of the Old Bailey for robbery and murder. The deposition of the murdered man was put in by the Crown, and the witnesses sworn who heard it, and Captain Cowan was called to support a portion of it. He swore that he supped with the deceased and loaded one pistol for him, while Mr. Gardiner loaded the other, lent him the key of his own door for further security, and himself slept in the city. The judge asked him where, and he said, "Parringdon Street." It was elicited from him that he had provided counsel for the prisoner. His evidence was very short and to the point. It did not directly touch the accused, and the defendant's counsel, in spite of his client's eager desire, declined to cross-examine Captain Cowan. He thought a hostile examination of so respectable a witness, who brought nothing home to the accused, would only raise more indignation against his client. The prosecution was strengthened by the reluctant evidence of Barbara Lamb. She deposed that 3 years ago Cox had been detected by her stealing money from a gentleman's table in the Swan Inn, and she gave the details. The judge asked her whether this was at night. "No, my lord, at about 4 of the clock. He is never in the house at night. The mistress can't abide him." "Has he any key of the house?" "Oh dear, no, my lord. The rest of the evidence for the Crown is virtually before the reader. For the defence, it was proved that the man was found drunk, with no money nor keys upon him, and that the knife was found under the wall, and the blood was traceable from the wall to the stable. Bradbury, who proved this, tried to get in about the wine, but this was stopped as irrelevant. "There is only one person under suspicion," said the judge, rather sternly. As counsel were not allowed in that day to make speeches to the jury, but only to examine and cross-examine and discuss points of law, Daniel Cox had to speak in his own defence. "My lord," said he, "it was my double done it." "Your what?" asked my lord, a little peevishly. "My double." "There's a rogue prowls about the Swan at nights, which you couldn't tell him from me." Laughter. "You needn't to laugh me to the gallows. I tell ye he have got a nose like mine." Laughter. Clerk of Arraigns. "Keep silence in the court, on pain of imprisonment. And he have got a waistcoat, the very spit of mine, and a tumble-down hat such as I do wear. I saw him go by and let himself into the Swan, with a key, and I told Sam Pott next morning. Judge, who is Sam Pott? Culprit. Why, my stable boy, to be sure. Judge, is he in court? Culprit. I don't know. Aye, there he is, Judge. Then you'd better call him. Culprit shouting. Hi, Sam, Sam, here be I. Loud laughter. The judge explained calmly that to call a witness meant to put him in the box and swear him, and that although it was irregular, yet he should allow Pott to be sworn, if it would do the prisoner any good. Prisoner's counsel said he had no wish to swear Mr. Pott. Well, Mr. Gurney, said the judge, I don't think he can do you any harm. meaning in so desperate a case. Thereupon Sam Pott was sworn and deposed that Cox had told him about this double. When? Often and often. Before the murder? Long afore that. Counsel for the Crown, did you ever see this double? Not I. Counsel, I thought not. Daniel Cox went on to say that on the night of the murder he was up with a sick horse, and he saw his double let himself out of the inn the back way, and then turn round and close the door softly, so he slipped out to meet him. But the double saw him and made for the garden wall. He ran up and caught him with one leg over the wall and seized a black bag he was carrying off. The figure dropped it, and he heard a lot of money chink, that thereupon he cried, "Thieves!" and seized the man, but immediately received a blow and lost his senses for a time. When he came to, the man and the bags were both gone, and he felt so sick that he staggered to the stable and drank a pint of neat brandy, and he remembered no more till they pumped on him, and told him he had robbed and murdered a gentleman inside the Swan Inn. "What they can't tell me," said Daniel, beginning to shout, "is how I could know who has got money and who hasn't inside the Swan Inn. I keeps the stables, not the inn, and where be my keys to open and shut the Swan? I never had none." "And where's the gentleman's money?" "'Twas somebody in the inn has done it, for to have the money, and when you find the money, you'll find the man." The prosecuting counsel ridiculed this defence, and inter alia asked the jury whether they thought it was a double. The witness Lamb had caught robbing in the inn 3 years ago. The judge summed up very closely, giving the evidence of every witness. What follows is a mere synopsis of his charge. He showed it was beyond doubt that Mr. Gardner returned to the inn with money, having collected his rents in Wiltshire, and this was known in the inn, and proved by several, and might have transpired in the yard or the tap-room. The unfortunate gentleman took Captain Cowan, a respectable person, his neighbour in the inn, into his confidence, and revealed his uneasiness. Captain Cowan swore that he supped with him, but could not stay all night, most unfortunately. But he encouraged him, left him his pistols, and helped him load them. Then his lordship read the dying man's deposition. The person, thus solemnly denounced, was found in the stable, bleeding from a recent wound, which seems to connect him at once with the deed as described by the dying man. "But here," said my lord, "the chain is no longer perfect. A knife, taken from the Swan, was found under the garden wall, and the first traces of blood commenced there, and continued to the stable, and were abundant on the straw and on the person of the accused. This was proved by the constable and others. No money was found on him, and no keys that could have opened any outer doors of the Swan Inn. The accused had, however, 3 years before been guilty of a theft from a gentleman in the inn, which negatives his pretence that he always confined himself to the stables. It did not, however, appear that on the occasion of the theft he had unlocked any doors or possessed the means. The witness for the Crown, Barbara Lamb, was clear on that. The prisoner's own solution of the mystery was not very credible. He said he had a double, or a person wearing his clothes and appearance, and he had seen this person prowling about long before the murder, and had spoken of the double to one Pott. Pott deposed that Cox had spoken of this double more than once, but admitted he never saw the double with his own eyes. "This double," says the accused, "on the fatal night let himself out of the Swan Inn and escaped to the garden wall. There, he, Cox, came up with this mysterious person, and a scuffle ensued in which a bag was dropped and gave the sound of coin, and then Cox held the man and cried, 'Thieves!' but presently received a wound and fainted. and on recovering himself, staggered to the stables and drank a pint of brandy. The story sounds ridiculous, and there is no direct evidence to back it, but there is a circumstance that lends some colour to it. There was one blood-stained instrument, and no more, found on the premises, and that knife answers to the description given by the dying man, and, indeed, may be taken to be the very knife missing from his room. And this knife was found under the garden wall, and there the blood commenced and was traced to the stable. "Here," said my lord, "to my mind lies the defence. Look at the case on all sides, gentlemen. An undoubted murder done by hands. No suspicion resting on any known person but the prisoner. A man who had already robbed in the inn. A confident recognition by one whose deposition is legal evidence, but evidence we cannot cross-examine, and a recognition by moonlight only, and in the heat of a struggle. If on this evidence, weakened not a little by the position of the knife and the traces of blood, and met by the prisoner's declaration, which accords with that single branch of the evidence, you have a doubt, it is your duty to give the prisoner the full benefit of that doubt, as I have endeavoured to do. And if you have no doubt, why then you have only to support the law and protect the lives of peaceful citizens. Whoever has committed this crime, it certainly is an alarming circumstance that, in a public inn, surrounded by honest people, guarded by locked doors and armed with pistols, a peaceful citizen can be robbed like this of his money and his life. The jury saw a murder at an inn, an accused, who had already robbed in that inn and was denounced as his murderer by the victim. The verdict seemed to them to be cocks of impunity. They all slept at inns, a double they had never seen, undetected accomplices they had all heard of. They waited 20 minutes and brought in their verdict, guilty. The judge put on his black cap and condemned Daniel Cox to be hanged by the neck till he was dead. Chapter 3. After the trial was over, and the condemned man led back to prison to await his execution, Bradbury went straight to Farringdon Street and inquired for Captain Cowan. "No such name here," said the good woman of the house. "But you keep lodgers." "Nay, we keep but one, and he is no captain, he is a city clerk." "Well, madam, it is not idle curiosity, I assure you, but was not the lodger before him, Captain Cowan?" "Laws, no. It was a parson. Your rig-helly captains wouldn't suit the like of us. 'Twas a reverend clerk, a grave old gentleman. He wasn't very well to do, I thinks, his cassock was worn, but he paid his way." "Keep late hours?" "Not when he was in town, but he had a country cure." "Then you have let him in after midnight?" "Nay, I keep no such hours. I lent him a pass-key. He came in and out from the country when he chose. I would have you to know he was an old man, and a sober man, and an honest man. I'd wager my life on that. And excuse me, sir, but who be you, that do catechize me to about my lodgers?" "I am an officer, madam." The simple woman turned pale and clasped her hands. "An officer!" she cried. "Alack, what have I done now?" "Why, nothing, madam," said the wily Bradbury. "An officer's business is to protect such as you, not to trouble you for all the world. There, now, I'll tell you where the shoe pinches. This Captain Cowan has just sworn in a court of justice that he slept here on the sea of last October. He never did then. Our good parson had no acquaintances in the town. Not a soul ever visited him." "Mother," said a young girl peeping in, "I think he knew somebody of that very name. He did ask me once to post a letter for him, and it was to some man of worship, and the name was Cowan. Yes, Cowan 'twas. I'm sure of it. By the same token, he never gave me another letter, and that made me pay the more attention." "Jane, you are too curious," said the mother. "And I am very much obliged to you, my little maid," said the officer, "and also to you, madam," and so took his leave. One evening, all of a sudden, Captain Cowan ordered a prime horse at the Swan, strapped his valise on before him, and rode out of the yard post-haste. He went without drawing bridle to Clapham, and then looked round him, and, seeing no other horseman near, trotted gently round into the borough, then into the city, and slept at an inn in Holborn. He had bespoken a particular room beforehand, a little room he frequented. He entered it with an air of anxiety, but this soon vanished after he had examined the floor carefully. His horse was ordered at 5 o'clock next morning. He took a glass of strong waters at the door to fortify his stomach, but breakfasted at Uxbridge and fed his good horse. He dined at Beaconsfield, halted at Thame, and supped with his son at Oxford. Next day paid all the young man's debts and spent a week with him. His conduct was strange, boisterously gay and sullenly despondent by turns. During the week came an unexpected visitor, General Sir Robert Barrington. This officer was going out to America to fill an important office. He had something in view for young Cowan, and came to judge quietly of his capacity. But he did not say anything at that time, for fear of exciting hopes he might possibly disappoint. However, he was much taken with the young man. Oxford had polished him. His modest reticence, until invited to speak, recommended him to older men, especially as his answers were judicious when invited to give his opinion. The tutors also spoke very highly of him. "You may well love that boy," said Central Barrington to the father. "God bless you for praising him," said the other. I love him too well." Soon after the general left, Cowan changed some gold for notes, and took his departure for London, having first sent word of his return. He meant to start after breakfast and make one day of it, but he lingered with his son, and did not cross Magdalen Bridge till 1 o'clock. This time he rode through Dorchester, Benson, and Henley, and, as it grew dark, resolved to sleep at Maidenhead. Just after Hurley Bottom, at 4 crossroads, 3 highwaymen spurred on him from right and left. "Your money or your life?" He whipped a pistol out of his holster and pulled at the nearest head in a moment. The pistol missed fire. The next moment a blow from the butt end of a horse pistol dazed him, and he was dragged off his horse, and his valise emptied in a minute. Before they had done with him, however, there was a clatter of hoofs, and the robbers sprang to their nags and galloped away for the bare life as a troop of yeomanry rode up. The thing was so common. The newcomers read the situation at a glance, and some of the best mounted gave chase. The others attended to Captain Cowan, caught his horse, strapped on his valise, and took him with them into Maidenhead, his head aching, his heart sickening and raging by turns. All his gold gone, nothing left but a few £1 notes that he had sewed into the lining of his coat. He reached the Swan next day in a state of sullen despair. "A curse is on me," he said. "My pistol missed fire, my gold gone." He was welcomed warmly. He stared with surprise. Barbara led the way to his old room, and opened it. He started back. "Not there," he said with a shudder. "Alack! Captain, we have kept it for you. Sure you are not afeard?" "No," said he doggedly. "No hope, no fear." She stared, but said nothing. He had hardly got into the room when, click, a key was turned in the door of communication. "A traveller there," said he. Then, bitterly, "Things are soon forgotten in an inn." "Not by me," said Barbara solemnly. "But you know our dame, she can't let money go by her. 'Tis our best room, mostly, and nobody would use it that knows the place. He is a stranger. He is from the wars, will have it. He is English, but talks foreign. He is civil enough when he is sober. but when he has got a drop, he does maunder away to be sure, and sing such songs, I never. How long has he been here? Asked Cowan. 5 days, and the mistress hopes he will stay as many more just to break the spell. He can stay or go, said Cowan. I am in no humour for company. I have been robbed, girl. You robbed, sir? Not openly, I'm sure. Openly, but by numbers 3 of them. I should soon have sped one, but my pistol snapped fire just like his. There, leave me, girl. Fate is against me, and a curse upon me. Bubbled out of my fortune in the city, robbed of my gold upon the road. To be honest is to be a fool. He flung himself on the bed with a groan of anguish, and the ready tears ran down soft Barbara's cheeks. She had tact, however, in her humble way, and did not prattle to a strong man in a moment of wild distress. She just turned and cast a lingering glance of pity on him, and went to fetch him food and wine. She had often seen an unhappy man the better for eating and drinking. When she was gone, he cursed himself for his weakness in letting her know his misfortunes. They would be all over the house soon. Why, that fellow next door must have heard me bawl them out. I have lost my head, said he, and I never needed it more. Barbara returned with the cold powdered beef and carrots, and a bottle of wine she had paid for herself. She found him sullen, but composed. He made her solemnly promise not to mention his losses. She consented readily, and said, You know I can hold my tongue. When he had eaten and drunk, and felt stronger, he resolved to put a question to her. How about that poor fellow? She looked puzzled a moment, then turned pale, and said solemnly, 'Tis for this day week, I hear. 'Twas to be last week, but the king did respite him for a fortnight. Ah, indeed! Do you know why? No, indeed. In his place, I'd rather have been put out of the way at once, for they will surely hang him. Now in our day, the respite is very rare. A criminal is hanged or reprieved. But at the period of our story, men were often respited for short or long periods, yet suffered at last. One poor wretch was respited for 2 years, yet executed. This respite, therefore, was nothing unusual, and Cowan, though he looked thoughtful, had no downright suspicion of anything so serious to himself as really lay beneath the surface of this not unusual occurrence. I shall, however, let the reader know more about it. The judge, in reporting the case, notified to the proper authority that he desired His Majesty to know he was not entirely at ease about the verdict. There was a lacuna in the evidence against this prisoner. He stated the flaw in a very few words, but he did not suggest any remedy. Now the public clamoured for the man's execution, that travellers might be safe. The king's adviser thought that if the judge had serious doubts, it was his business to tell the jury so. The order for execution issued. 3 days after this, the judge received a letter from Bradbury, which I give verbatim. The King versus 2. Cox, my lord, forgive my writing to you in a case of blood. There is no other way. Daniel Cox was not defended. Counsel went against his wish, and would not throw suspicion on any other. That made it Cox, or nobody. But there was a man in the inn whose conduct was suspicious. He furnished the wine that made the victim sleepy, and I must tell you, the landlady would not let me see the remnant of the wine. She did everything to baffle me and defeat justice. He loaded 2 pistols so that neither could go off. He has got a pass key, and goes in and out of the Swan at all hours. He provided counsel for Daniel Cox. That could only be through compunction. He swore in court that he slept that night at Farringdon Street. Your lordship will find it on your notes, for 'twas you put the question, and methinks heaven inspired you. An hour after the trial, I was at Farringdon Street. No Cowan and no captain had ever lodged there nor slept there. Present lodger, a city clerk, lodger at date of murder, an old clergyman that said he had a country cure, had got the simple body to trust him with the pass-key, so he came in and out at all hours of the night. This man was no clerk, but, as I believe, the cracksman that did the job at the Swan. My lord, there is always two in a job of this sort, the professional man and the confederate. Cowan was the confederate, hocused the wine, loaded the pistols, and lent his pass-key to the cracksman. The cracksman opened the door with his tools, unless Cowan made him duplicate keys. Neither of them intended violence, or they would have used their own weapons. The wine was drugged expressly to make that needless. The cracksman, instead of a black mask, put on a calfskin waistcoat and a bottle nose, and that passed muster for Cox by moonlight. It puzzled Cox by moonlight, and deceived Gardner by moonlight. For the love of God, get me a respite for the innocent man, and I will undertake to bring the crime home to the cracksman and to his confederate Cowan. Bradbury signed this with his name and quality. The judge was not sorry to see the doubt his own wariness had raised so powerfully confirmed. He sent this missive on to the minister with the remark that he had received a letter which ought not to have been sent to him, but to those in whose hands the prisoner's fate rested. He thought it his duty, however, to transcribe from his notes the question he had put to Captain Cowan, and his reply, that he had slept at Paddington Street on the night of the murder, and also the substance of the prisoner's defence, with the remark that, as stated by that uneducated person, it had appeared ridiculous, but that after studying this Bow Street officer's statements, and assuming them to be in the main correct, it did not appear ridiculous, but only remarkable, and it reconciled all the undisputed facts, whereas that Cox with the murderer was, and ever must remain, irreconcilable with the position of the knife and the track of the blood. Bradbury's letter and the above comment found their way to the king, and he granted what was asked, a respite. Bradbury and his fellows went to work to find the old clergyman, alias Cracksman, but he had melted away without a trace, and they got no other clue. But during Cowan's absence they got a traveller, i.e. a disguised agent, into the inn, who found relics of wax in the keyholes of Cowan's outer door and of the door of communication. Bradbury sent this information in 2 letters, one to the judge and one to the minister. But this did not advance him much. He had long been sure that Cowan was in it. It was the professional hand, the actual robber and murderer, he wanted. The days succeeded one another, nothing was done. He lamented, too late, he had not applied for a reprieve or even a pardon. He deplored his own presumption in assuming that he could unravel such a mystery entirely. His busy brain schemed night and day. He lost his sleep and even his appetite. At last, in sheer despair, he proposed to himself a new solution, and acted upon it in the dark and with consummate subtlety, for he said to himself, "I am in deeper water than I thought. Lord, how they skim a case at the Old Bailey! They take a pond for a puddle, and go to fathom it with a forefinger." Captain Cowan sank into a settled gloom, but he no longer courted solitude. It gave him the horrors. He preferred to be in company, though he no longer shone in it. He made acquaintance with his neighbour, and rather liked him. The man had been in the commissariat department, and seemed half surprised at the honour. A captain did him in conversing with him. But he was well versed in all the incidents of the late wars, and Cowan was glad to go with him into the past, for the present was dead and the future horrible. This Mr. Cutler, so deferential when sober, was inclined to be more familiar when in his cups, and that generally ended in his singing and talking to himself in his own room in the absurdest way. He never went out without a black leather case strapped across his back like a dispatch box. When joked and asked as to the contents, he used to say, "Papers, papers," curtly. One evening, being rather the worse for liquor, he dropped it, and there was a metallic sound. This was immediately commented on by the wags of the company. "That fell heavy for paper," said one. "And there was a ring," said another. "Come, unload thy pack, comrade, and show us thy papers." Cutler was sobered in a moment, and looked scared. Cowan observed this, and quietly left the room. He went upstairs to his own room, and, mounting on a chair, he found a thin place in the partition, and made an eyelet hole. That very night he made use of this with good effect. Cutler came up to bed, singing and whistling, but presently threw down something heavy, and was silent. Cowan spied, and saw him kneel down, draw from his bosom a key suspended round his neck by a ribbon, and open the dispatch box. There were papers in it, but only to deaden the sound of a great many new guineas that glittered in the light of the candle, and seemed to fire and fill the receptacle. Cutler looked furtively round, plunged his hands in them, took them out by handfuls, admired them, kissed them, and seemed to worship them, locked them up again, and put the black case under his pillow. While they were glaring in the light, Cowan's eyes flashed with unholy fire. He clutched his hands at them where he stood, but they were inaccessible. He sat down despondent and cursed the injustice of fate, bubbled out of money in the city, robbed on the road, but when another had money, it was safe. He left his keys in the locks of both doors, and his gold never quitted him. Not long after this discovery, he got a letter from his son, telling him that the college bill for battles, or commons, had come in, and he was unable to pay it. He begged his father to disburse it, or he should lose credit. This tormented the unhappy father, and the proximity of gold tantalized him, so that he bought a phial of laudanum, and secreted it about his person. "Better die," said he, "and leave my boy to Barrington. Such a legacy from his dead comrade will be sacred, and he has the world at his feet." He even ordered a bottle of red port, and kept it by him to swill the laudanum in, and so get drunk and die. But when it came to the point, he faltered. Meantime, the day drew near for the execution of Daniel Cox. Bradbury had undertaken too much. His cracksman seemed to the king's advisers as shadowy as the double of Daniel Cox. The evening before that fatal day, Cowan came to a wild resolution. He would go to Tyburn at noon, which was the hour fixed, and would die under that man's gibbet. So was this powerful mind unhinged. This desperate idea was uppermost in his mind when he went up to his bedroom. But he resisted. No, he would never play the coward while there was a chance left on the cards. While there is life, there is hope. He seized the bottle, uncorked it, and tossed off a glass. It was potent, and tingled through his veins and warmed his heart. He set the bottle down before him. He filled another glass, but before he put it to his lips, jocund noises were heard coming up the stairs, and noisy, drunken voices, and two boon companions of his neighbour Cutler, who had a double-bedded room opposite him, parted with him for the night. He was not drunk enough, it seems, for he kept demanding "t'other bottle." His friends, however, were of a different opinion. They bundled him into his room and locked him in from the other side, and shortly after burst into their own room and were more garrulous than articulate. Cutler, thus disposed of, kept saying and shouting and whining that he must have "t'other bottle." In short, anyone at a distance would have thought he was announcing 16 different propositions, so various were the accents of anger, grief, expostulation, deprecation, supplication, imprecation. and whining tenderness in which he declared he must have t'other bowl. At last he came bump against the door of communication. "Neighbour," said he, "your worship, I mean, great man of war." "Well, sir, let's have t'other bowl." Cowan's eyes flashed. He took out his phial of laudanum and emptied about a fifth part of it into the bottle. Cutler whined at the door. "Do open the door, your worship, and let's have t'other hick. Why, the key is on your side." A feeble-minded laugh at the discovery. A fumbling with the key, and the door opened, and Cutler stood in the doorway, with his cravat disgracefully loose, and his visage wreathed in foolish smiles. His eyes joggled. He pointed with a mixture of surprise and low cunning at the table. "Why, there is t'other bowl. Let's have 'em." "Nay," said Cowan, "I drain no bottles at this time. 1 glass suffices me. I drink your health." He raised his glass. Cutler grabbed the bottle and said brutally, "And I'll drink yours," and shut the door with a slam, but was too intent on his prize to lock it. Cowan sat and listened. He heard the wine gurgle and the drunkard draw a long breath of delight. Then there was a pause. Then a snatch of song, rather melodious and more articulate than Mr. Cutler's recent attempts at discourse. Then another gurgle, and another loud "Ah!" Then a vocal attempt, which broke down by degrees. Then a snore. Then a somnolent remark, "All right." Then a staggering onto his feet. Then a swaying to and fro, and a subsiding against the door. Then, by and by, a little reel at the bed, and a fall flat on the floor. Then stertorous breathing. Cowan sat still at the keyhole some time, then took off his boots and softly mounted his chair and applied his eye to the peephole. Cutler was lying on his stomach between the table and the bed. Cowan came to the door on tiptoe and turned the handle gently. The door yielded. He lost nerve for the first time in his life. What horrible shame should the man come to his senses and see him! He stepped back into his own room, ripped up his portmanteau, and took out, from between the leather and the lining, a disguise and a mask. He put them on. Then he took his loaded cane, for he thought to himself, "No more stabbing in that room," and he crept through the door like a cat. The man lay breathing stertorously, and his lips blowing out at every exhalation like lifeless lips urged by a strong wind, so that Cowan began to fear, not that he might wake, but that he might die. It flashed across him. He should have to leave England. What he came to do seemed now wonderfully easy. He took the key by its ribbon carefully off the sleeper's neck, unlocked the dispatch box, took off his hat, put the gold into it, locked the dispatch box, replaced the key, took up his hatful of money, and retired slowly on tiptoe as he came. He had but deposited his stick and the booty on the bed when the sham drunkard pinned him from behind and uttered a shrill whistle. With a fierce snarl, Cowan whirled his captor round like a feather and dashed with him against the post of his own door, stunning the man so that he relaxed his hold, and Cowan whirled him round again and kicked him in the stomach so felly that he was doubled up out of the way, and contributed nothing more to the struggle except his last meal. At this very moment, 2 Bow Street runners rushed madly upon Cowan through the door of communication. He met one in full career with a blow so tremendous that it sounded through the house and drove him all across the room against the window, where he fell down senseless. The other he struck rather short, and though the blood spurted and the man staggered, he was on him again in a moment and pinned him. Cowan, a master of pugilism, got his head under his left shoulder and pommelled him cruelly, but the fellow managed to hold on till a powerful foot kicked in the door at a blow, and Bradbury himself sprang on Captain Cowan with all the fury of a tiger. He seized him by the throat from behind and throttled him, and set his knee to his back. The other, though mauled and bleeding, whipped out a short rope and pinioned him in a turn of the hand. Then all stood panting, but the disabled men, and once more the passage and the room were filled with pale faces and panting bosoms. Lights flashed on the scene, and instantly loud screams from the landlady and her maids, and as they screamed, they pointed with trembling fingers. And well they might. There caught red-handed in an act of robbery and violence, a few steps from the place of the mysterious murder, stood the stately figure of Captain Cowan and the mottled face and bottle nose of Daniel Cox, condemned to die in just 12 hours' time. Chapter 4th. "Aye, scream, ye fools!" roared Bradbury. "That couldn't see a church by daylight." Then, shaking his fist at Cowan, "Thou villain! 'Tisn't one man you have murdered, 'tis two. But please God, I'll save one of them yet, and hang you in his place. Way there, not a moment to lose." In another minute they were all in the yard, and a hackney coach sent for. Captain Cowan said to Bradbury, "This thing on my face is choking me." "Oh, better than you have been choked at Tyburn and all." "Hang me. Don't pillory me. I've served my country." Bradbury removed the wax mask. He said afterward he had no power to refuse the villain, he was so grand and gentle. "Thank you, sir. Now, what can I do for you? Save Daniel Cox? Aye, do that and I'll forgive you. Give me a sheet of paper." Bradbury, impressed by the man's tone of sincerity, took him into the bar, and getting all his men round him, placed paper and ink before him. He addressed to General Barrington, in attendance on His Majesty, these: "General, see His Majesty betimes, tell him from me that Daniel Cox, condemned to die at noon, is innocent, and get him a reprieve. O Barrington, come to your lost comrade. The bearer will tell you where I am. I cannot. E. W. Cowan." "Send a man you can trust to Windsor with that, and take me to my most welcome death." A trusty officer was dispatched to Windsor, and in about an hour Cowan was lodged in Newgate. All that night Bradbury laboured to save the man that was condemned to die. He knocked up the Sheriff of Middlesex and told him all. "Don't come to me," said the Sheriff. "Go to the minister." He rode to the minister's house. The minister was up. His wife gave a ball, windows blaring, shadows dancing, music's lights. Night turned into day. Bradbury knocked. The door flew open and revealed a line of bedizened footmen, dotted at intervals up the stairs. "I must see my lord." "Life or death?" "I'm an officer from Bow Street." "You can't see my lord." "Ha! Is entertaining the Croatian ambassador and his suite. I must see him, or an innocent man will die tomorrow. Tell him so. Here's a guinea. Is there? Step aside here." He waited in torments till the message went through the gamut of lackeys and got, more or less mutilated, to the minister. He detached a buffet, who proposed to Mr. Bradbury to call at the Doolittle office in Westminster next morning. "No," said Bradbury, "I don't leave the house till I see him. Innocent blood shall not be spilled for want of a word in time." The buffer retired, and in came a duffer who said the occasion was not convenient. "Aye, but it is," said Bradbury, "and if my lord is not here in 5 minutes, I'll go upstairs and tell my tale before them all, and see if they are all hairdressers' dummies, without heart or conscience or sense." In 5 minutes in came a gentleman, with an order on his breast, and said, "You are a Bow Street officer?" "Yes, my lord." "Name?" "Bradbury." "You say the man condemned to die tomorrow is innocent?" "Yes, my lord. How do you know?" "Just taken the real culprit. When is the other to suffer?" 12 tomorrow. "Seems short time." Humph. Will you be good enough to take a line to the sheriff? Formal message tomorrow. The actual message ran, delay execution of Cox till we hear from Windsor. Bearer will give reasons. With this, Bradbury hurried away, not to the sheriff, but to the prison, and infected the jailer and the chaplain and all the turnkeys with pity for the condemned and the spirit of delay. Bradbury breakfasted and washed his face and off to the sheriff. Sheriff was gone out. Bradbury hunted him from pillar to post and could find him nowhere. He was at last obliged to go and wait for him at Newgate. He arrived at the stroke of 12 to superintend the execution. Bradbury put the minister's note into his hand. "This no use," said he. "I want an order from His Majesty, or the Privy Council at least." "Not to delay," suggested the chaplain. "You have Anne the day for it." "All the day." "I can't be all the day hanging a single man. My time is precious, gentlemen." Then, his bark being worse than his bite, he said, "I shall come again at 4 o'clock, and then, if there is no news from Windsor, the law must take its course." He never came again, though, for even as he turned his back to retire, there was a faint cry from the farthest part of the crowd. A paper raised on a hussar's lance, and as the mob fell back on every aide, a royal aide-de-camp rode up, followed closely by the mounted runner, and delivered to the sheriff a reprieve under the sign manual of His Majesty George I. At p.m. of the same day, Sir Robert Barrington reached Newgate and saw Captain Cowen in private. That unhappy man fell on his knees and made a confession. Barrington was horrified and turned as cold as ice to him. He stood erect as a statue. "A soldier to rob," said he. "Murder was bad enough, but to rob." Cowen, with his head and hands all hanging down, could only say, faintly, "I have been robbed and ruined, and it was for my boy. Ah, me! What will become of him? I have lost my soul for him, and now he will be ruined and disgraced by me, who would have died for him." The strong man shook with agony, and his head and hands almost touched the ground. Sir Robert Barrington looked at him and pondered. "No," said he, relenting a little. "That is the one thing I can do for you. I had made up my mind to take your son to Canada as my secretary, and I will take him. But he must change his name. I sail next Thursday." The broken man stared wildly, then started up and blessed him, and from that moment the wild hope entered his breast that he might keep his son unstained by his crime, and even ignorant of it. Barrington said that was impossible, but yielded to the father's prayers and consented to act as if it was possible. He would send a messenger to Oxford with money and instructions to bring the young man up and put him on board the ship at Gravesend. This difficult scheme once conceived, there was not a moment to be lost. Barrington sent down a mounted messenger to Oxford with money and instructions. Cowen sent for Bradbury and asked him when he was to appear at Bow Street. "Tomorrow, I suppose." "Do me a favour. Get all your witnesses, make the case complete, and show me only once to the public before I am tried." "Well, Captain," said Bradbury, "you were square with me about poor Cox. I don't see as it matters much to you, but I'll not say you nay." He saw the solicitor for the Crown, and asked a few days to collect all his evidence. The functionary named Friday. This was conveyed next day to Cowen, and put him in a fever. It gave him a chance of keeping his son ignorant, but no certainty. Ships were eternally detained at Gravesend, waiting for a wind. There were no steam tugs then to draw them into blue water. Even going down the channel, letters boarded them if the wind slacked. He walked his room to and fro, like a caged tiger, day and night. Wednesday evening, Barrington came with the news that his son was at the Star in Cornhill. "I have got him to bed," said he, "and, Lord forgive me, I have let him think he will see you before we go down to Gravesend tomorrow." "Then let me see him," said the miserable father. "He shall know naught from me." They applied to the jailer and urged that he could be a prisoner all the time, surrounded by constables in disguise. No, the jailer would not risk his place and an indictment. Bradbury was sent for and made light of the responsibility. "I brought him here," said he, "and I will take him to the Star, I and my fellows. Indeed, he will give us no trouble this time." "Why, that would blow the gaff, and make the young gentleman fly to the whole thing." "It can only be done by authority," was the jailer's reply. "Then by authority it shall be done," said Sir Robert. Mr. Robert, Bradbury, have 3 men here with a coach at 1 o'clock, and a regiment, if you like, to watch the Star." Punctually at 1 came Barrington with an authority. It was a request from the Queen. The jailer took it respectfully. It was an authority not worth a button, but he knew he could not lose his place, with this writing to brandish at need. The father and son dined with the general at the Star. Bradbury and one of his fellows waited as private servants. Other officers, in plain clothes, watched back and front. At 3 o'clock, father and son parted, the son with many tears, the father with dry eyes, but a voice that trembled as he blessed him. Young Cowan, now Morris, went down to Gravesend with his chief, the criminal, back to Newgate, respectfully bowed from the door of the Star by landlord and waiters. At first he was comparatively calm, but as the night advanced became restless, and by and by began to pace his cell again like a caged lion. At 20 minutes past 11, a turnkey brought him a line. A horseman had galloped in with it from Gravesend. "A fair wind, we weigh anchor at the full tide. It is a merchant vessel, and the captain under my orders to keep off shore and take no messages. Farewell. Turn to the God you have forgotten. He alone can pardon you." On receiving this note, Cowan betook him to his knees. In this attitude the jailer found him when he went his round. He waited till the captain rose, and then let him know that an able lawyer was in waiting, instructed to defend him at Bow Street next morning. The truth is, the females of the Swan had clubbed money for these purposes. Cowan declined to see him. "I thank you, sir," said he. "I will defend myself." He said, however, he had a little favour to ask. "I have been," said he, "of late much agitated and fatigued, and a sore trial awaits me in the morning. A few hours of unbroken sleep would be a boon to me. The turnkeys must come in to see you are all right. It is their duty, but I will lie in sight of the door if they will be good enough not to wake me." "There can be no objection to that, Captain, and I am glad to see you calmer." "Thank you, never calmer in my life." He got his pillow, set 2 chairs, and composed himself to sleep. He put the candle on the table, that the turnkeys might peep through the door and see him. Once or twice they peeped in very softly, and saw him sleeping in the full light of the candle, to moderate which, apparently, he had thrown a white handkerchief over his face. At 9 in the morning they brought him his breakfast, as he must be at Bow Street between 10 and 11. When they came so near him, it struck them he lay too still. They took off the handkerchief. He had been dead some hours. Yes, there, calm, grave, and noble, incapable, as it seemed, either of the passions that had destroyed him, or the tender affection which redeemed yet inspired his crimes, lay the corpse of Edward Cowan. Thus miserably perished a man in whom were many elements of greatness. He left what little money he had to Bradbury in a note imploring him to keep particulars out of the journals, for his son's sake, and such was the influence on Bradbury of the scene at the Star, the man's dead face, and his dying words, that, though public detail was his interest, nothing transpired but that the gentleman who had been arrested on suspicion of being concerned in the murder at the Swan Inn had committed suicide, to which was added by another hand. Cox, however, has the King's pardon, and the affair still remains shrouded with mystery. Cox was permitted to see the body of Cowan, and, whether the features had gone back to youth, or his own brain, long sobered in earnest, had enlightened his memory, recognized him as a man he had seen committed for horse-stealing at Ipswich, when he himself was the mayor's groom. But some girl lent the accused a file, and he cut his way out of the cage. Cox's calamity was his greatest blessing. He went into Newgate scarcely knowing there was a God. He came out thoroughly enlightened in that respect by the teaching of the chaplain and the death of Cowan. He went in a drunkard. The noose that dangled over his head so long terrified him into long sobriety, for he laid all the blame on liquor, and he came out as bitter a foe to drink, as drink had been to him. His case excited sympathy. A considerable sum was subscribed to set him up in trade. He became a horse-dealer on a small scale, but he was really a most excellent judge of horses, and, being sober, enlarged his business, horsed a coach or two, attended fairs, and eventually made a fortune by dealing in cavalry horses under government contracts. As his money increased, his nose diminished, and when he died, old and regretted, only a pink tinge revealed the habits of his earlier life. Mrs. Martha Cust and Barbara Lamb were no longer sure, but they doubted to their dying day the innocence of the ugly fellow and the guilt of the handsome, civil-spoken gentleman. But they converted nobody to their opinion, for they gave their reasons.